What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto son of Shinigami? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. Retsu Unohana wasn't sure what to make of the person stood before her, standing at attention, hands behind his back and a small smile on his face. He had spiky blonde hair, blue eyes even brighter than her own, and 3 whisker birthmarks on his face. A body that seemed to have been sculpted for nothing but combat. Every inch of him was covered in tight, compact muscle, a perfect mix of power and speed. He wore the standard Shinigami robe, with what seemed to be an orange shirt under it that could be from how it was slightly open at the top, an orange rope holding the robe together, and at his side was a katana. The strangest thing about the katana was the fact that tied tightly around the guard and sheath were blood-red bandages, making it impossible to draw the blade without first removing them. His name was Naruto Uzumaki, the newest member of the 4th Division, and without a doubt one of the last people she would have expected to request being placed into it. He was an average student in almost every class of the academy, kept mostly to himself according to the report she had been given on him, and had decent skill with a sword. In fact, the only class he had outright failed was healing Kido. According to her report, he didn't even know the name of his Zanpakuto yet. Yet the only times Unohana had ever seen someone rap their Zanpakuto like he had, was when they knew the name, but feared what it could do. He had been offered place in the 11th Division straight out of the academy. But he refused, and asked to be placed in the 4th Division, which led the question. Why? Getting a confused expression on his face and tilting his head slightly, Unohana fought to keep her usual sweet smile, holding the giggle in the back of her throat. Captain, why the 4th Division? From what I have seen of your report, you would be much more suited in the 11th. Yet you requested specifically to be placed here. I can't help but wonder, why? A smile crossed Naruto's face as he seemed to finally understand the question was. Well, I don't really like fighting if I don't have to. And although I can't use healing Kido, I would be happy to help in any other way possible, even cleaning. It sounds like you just spent the least 5 years training to be a Shinigami, only to become a cleaner? You do realize that the 4th Division is not the most respected, and you will be resigning yourself to ridicule from the other divisions. Also, despite us not being a combat-focused division, we are still sent out to the field for support. You might still be forced to fight. I understand, Captain Unohana, and I am willing to fight when needed, but until that time comes I would be happier under your command. Lacing her hands in front of her mouth to hide the small frown, Unohana leaned back in her seat, her eyes moving to the sword on the blonde's hip. Tell me, Uzumaki-san, from your report, you do not yet know the name of your Zanpakuto? That is correct, Captain. Then why, Uzumaki-san, would you feel the need to wrap it in such a way that it cannot be drawn? An action I have only ever seen done by those that are afraid of their Zanpakuto. I think there is something you are not telling me, Uzumaki-san. She didn't miss the way he stiffened, his hand moving as if to check the sword was still wrapped, his eyes widening slightly in fear before he caught himself. I told you, Captain, I don't like fighting. Slowly getting to her feet, Unohana moved around her desk to stand in front of Naruto, the younger Shinigami lowering his head so he wasn't looking her in the eye. As it stands, I have no reason to refuse your request to join the 4th Division, however, I will be keeping a close eye on you, Uzumaki-san, until I feel I can trust you. Letting out a sigh, Naruto gave a low bow, a smile once again on his face. Thank you, Captain Unohana. I promise I will prove myself to you. Letting her usual smile cross her lips, Unohana nodded as if nothing had happened, before turning to the closed door. Izan-san. The moment she spoke the name, the door opened to reveal Izan Kotetsu, the current vice captain of the 4th Division. She gave a low bow, one hand resting on her Zanpakuto, before standing next to Naruto at attention. Captain, Izan-san, please show Uzumaki-san to his room, and starting tomorrow put him on the cleanup team. Of course, Captain. The room Izan left Naruto in was small, but more than enough for him, and it was better than the rooms they had at the academy. There was a small bed next to the widow, which overlooked the training ground, and a desk with a lamp stood against the wall on his left. The floor was simple wood, and the walls a plain white, but according to Izan he were allowed to decorate it however he wanted. Naruto waited until he heard the vice captain's footsteps fade as she walked away, and the moment they were out of range, realized a deep sigh as his shoulders slumped slightly. Taking the Zanpakuto from his hip, Naruto walked over to his bed before gently laying it down, as if worried it was about to explode in his face, before backing away and falling into his desk chair. Insolent woman, why did you let her talk to you like that? Falling deeper into his chair, Naruto let out another sigh as he turned it to face the bed, his eyes locked on the sword. She's my captain, and a good person, she deserves my respect. Respect? Ha, where was her respect to you? Acting all high and mighty, looking down on you, you should have used me. Frowning at his Zanpakuto's words, Naruto stood up and turned his back to it, walking to stand on the other side of the room. Stop it, I will not attack my captain because you think she was rude, it would be stupid. Not if you used me. You know we could kill her, and every other worthless captain, if you would just use me. Flinching, Naruto closed his eyes and leaned his head against banging his fist against the wall next to him. Stop it, I told you no, I will not use you. But Naru-kun, I want to hunt, to feel blood running down my metal. Just a little, and I will stop asking, please. Frowning, Naruto spun around and stomped over to the bed, before grabbing his pillow and slamming it on top of it. Letting out another sigh, Naruto sat down on the bed next to his Zanpakuto, moving the pillow so he could lay his hand on the hilt. I said no, Kyuubi-chan, I know what using you means, and if I have any other choice will not resort to that. Humph, you know when I told you my name I was expecting us to work together and kill all in our path, you're just lucky you're so cute. Chuckling slightly, Naruto got up and moved back over to the desk chair, closing his eyes and letting himself slowly fall into sleep. A week later Hana stood watching Naruto from her window, planning on following through on her warning to keep an eye on him, but could only frown slightly at what she was seeing. The blonde was currently sweeping the leaves into a pile from the training ground, a smile on his face and Zanpakuto on his hip, working faster than the other 3 members of her division that were helping him put together. Over the week Naruto had proven to be a machine, working 3 times faster than any other members assigned to the same job as him, and was yet to show any sign of being tired. His stamina was impressive for a fresh graduate, if nothing else. She just couldn't figure him out, knowing something wasn't right but being unable to do anything about it without proof, and it was distracting her from her work. Captain Hana, are you alright? Blinking in surprise, having forgotten that she was not alone, Hana turned to look at the worried face of her vice captain with her usual smile on her face. I am fine Izan-san, just a little distracted, please, tell me, what are your thoughts on Uzumaki-san? Looking slightly surprised, Izan took a moment to think, before shrugging her shoulders. He seems like a nice person from the short conversation we had when I was leading him to his room, polite, a little quite maybe but nothing odd. Though I must admit I was surprised when I learned who he was, I'm not sure what I was expecting. Her interest piqued, Hana nodded for her vice captain to continue, her full attention fixed on the tall sliver-haired woman before her. Go on. Taking the seat in front of the captain's desk, Izan looked around slightly uncomfortably, her hands on her lap in front of her. Well, it's just, 4 years ago I remember several new recruits talking about him. About how he was so ruthless, a demon in battle that enjoyed fighting even the older students at the academy. They spoke of him in fear. But then the year after, I hear the next group of new recruits talking about how he just seemed to change, one day without warning. He stopped picking fights, and started wrapping his Zanpakuto in bandages and refused to draw it even for spares. Hana listened to every word, taking them in and storing them for later thought, but before she could comment, Izan continued. Then there was that instructor that was said to use a year ago, the one with almost every bone in his body broken. I treated him myself. Apparently he tried to force Uzumaki-san to draw his Zanpakuto for a spar against another student, but he went crazy and used it while still sheathed against him. He was embarrassed and asked me to put in my report that he fell down the stairs, but I remember it clearly. Turning her chair to once again look out the window to look at the blonde with a frown on her face, Hana was surprised to see the large pile of leaves next to him, the others panting on the ground while Naruto looked as if he had just been on a slow walk. I see, thank you Izan-san, I want you to keep an eye on Uzumaki-san. Take him on as a training partner, make sure he knows it is by my orders. I want to know just how skilled he really is as a fighter. But Captain Hana, he is a newly graduated Shinigami. I have many years worth of experience over him. To expect me to train with him would be an insult to my honor. Letting out a small amount of ki, but keeping her smile, Hana turned to look at her vice captain as she froze in her seat, a look in absolute fear on her face. Izan-san, this is not a request. I want you to take Uzumaki-san as your training partner, taking him under your wing and to find out just what he is hiding. From this day on he will be your shadow, understood? Nodding her head rapidly, Izan quickly stood up and ran from the room, Hana letting out a small chuckle at the sight. I still have it. Having just finished clearing the leaves from the training ground, Naruto pulled out the chore list he had been given, crossing it off before looking to the next job for the day. Clean the 10th Division's windows, shouldn't take too long. Returning the list to his pocket, Naruto ignored the people currently laying on the ground panting, shaking his head at them for tiring themselves out trying to keep up with him. Uzumaki-san. He had only gotten 3 steps before being stopped by the sound of the vice captain calling him, turning to see her walking over to him at a sedate pace now that she had his attention. Vice Captain Izan, is there something I can help you with? I was about to go clean the 10th Division's windows. Then after that I have to water the plants in the 2nd, clean the floors in the 6th and dust the 8th. Coming to a stop in front of the blonde, sparing a glance at the others still panting on the floor with a shake of the head, Izan pointed to the one that seemed the least likely to faint. Give your list to him, Captain Hana has asked me to train with you in order to evaluate your skills. You're also to be my shadow, so from now on you will be working with me. Getting a confused expression, Naruto reached up and scratched the back of his head, passing the list over without even looking. But I have no skill with healing Kido. In fact I think I made things worse the last time I tried. Before I attempted to fix it my partner only had a broken finger, after he had 3 broken fingers and a fractured arm. Letting out an uncomfortable chuckle, a sweat drop falling on the back of her head, Izan quickly recovered and shook her head as she placed her hand on her Zanpakuto. I heard about that actually, but that's not what we are training in. I am to be your training, sparring partner, so if you could follow me to the inside dojo. Hey, where are you going? The moment she said sparring, Naruto had grabbed his list back and started walking off, waving over his shoulder. Thanks, but I don't really need a sparring partner, I'm happy on cleaning duties. This is not a request Uzumaki-san. Captain Hana has put you under my personal care, which means you will come with me now or risk being brought up on charges for insubordination. Freezing on the spot, Naruto took a moment to consider his options, before letting out a sigh and tossing his list back to the unnamed squad member and turning back to face Izan with a resigned expression on his face. I understand Izan-san, my apologies, please lead the way. Still frowning slightly at his attitude, Izan nodded and led Naruto back into the barracks, down several corridors before opening the door to a medium-sized dojo. Nodding to the mat, Izan closed the door behind him, before moving to stand across from him and drawing her Zanpakuto. Unwrap your Zanpakuto, Uzumaki-san. We will start with a straight-up spar so that I can assess your skills before we move on to anything else. The moment she said, unwrap, every muscle in Naruto's body stiffened. His hand shoot to the handle as if to check the bandages were still there, before turning his attention back to the vice captain and gulped. Would it be okay if I keep it sheathed? If I need to I will draw it, but I do not feel comfortable pointing an uncovered weapon at a comrade. Frowning, Izan thought about it for a moment before letting out a tired sigh and shrugging her shoulders. It's fine I guess, but remember I am a vice captain for a reason. No matter how skilled you may think you are still only a day out of the academy. Don't get. Of course, Vice Captain Izan, I did not mean to sound arrogant. I really am just uncomfortable at the idea of drawing my Zanpakuto against a comrade. Giving a low bow, Naruto slowly pulled his katana from its place at his hip, sheath and all. Without any more words, they both fell into ready stances, Naruto's being slightly lower the Isanes with his Zanpakuto at his side insisted of in front like hers. This made the older Shinigami's eyes to narrow slightly, knowing that it wasn't a stance taught in the academy, so where did he learn it? She also didn't miss the odd look that came to the blonde's eyes the moment he took the sword from his hip. It was as if they changed from bright and innocent to cold and dead the moment the weapon was in his hand. If she was being honest with herself, Izan would admit she was a little put off by the look. But he was only a freshly graduated academy student, and she was a vice captain with at least 100 years experience over him. What was there for her to be worried about? At some unseen signal, they both jumped forward, closing the space between them in an instant. It happened so fast Izan didn't know what happened. 1 second she was swinging at Naruto's side when the world spun around her. And the next she was looking up at him with her back on the ground and a bruise on the back of her head. His katana was back on his hip. His face once again taking on the innocent expression as he held a hand out to her, offering to help her back to her feet. Groaning, one hand moving to the bruise on her head, Izan slapped the hand away and got to her feet. Quickly moving back to her position on the other side of the mat, the silver-haired vice captain sent him a hard look over her Zanpakuto, her voice suddenly a lot more stiff and formal. Again, Izan-san, again. Letting out a sigh, Naruto once again took his sheathed Zanpakuto from his hip, his eyes turning cold the moment it was in his hand. This time Izan didn't wait, and charged forward before Naruto could get into his stance, only to once again end up on her back before she could even see him move. Izan-san, are you okay? Locking her slightly dazed eyes back on the blonde, Izan saw that he had once again put his Zanpakuto on his hip and was offering her his hand, which she again swatted away. Returning to her passion, she turned to face the blonde with a growl of annoyance, the fact she had lost twice in a row to a fresh graduate starting to get to her. Again, and stop putting away your Zanpakuto. Izan-san please, I really don't want to do this. Run, Itagumo. With a small flash, her Shikai released, 2 extra blades shooting from the pommel. Hana had been watching the two from the door, being careful not to be seen or heard, and so far everything she had seen had only made her eyes narrow. He had moved with such swiftness and grace, faster than the untrained eye could follow, and both times had simple hit Izan on the head in such a way it would disorientate her enough to knock her to the ground. And the moment she fell, he would quickly return his blade to his hip, as if he didn't trust himself to hold it for longer than necessary. The moment Naruto's hand touched his Zanpakuto, the look he got in his eyes as he prepared to fight, it was a look she had seen only twice before. He had lied to her before, when he claimed not to like fighting, she could see it the moment she touched his blade with the intention of using it. Naruto Uzumaki, without a doubt, loved fighting, so much in fact that he was scared of how much he loved it. The look in his eyes had been the same she had herself so many years ago, the same look Zaraki Kenpachi had now, the look of bloodlust. She didn't miss his words before the two started either, about being uncomfortable at the idea of drawing his Zanpakuto against a comrade, but again that had not been the whole truth. He was scared of what he would do to a comrade if he lost control. But this didn't make any sense. For one thing, he didn't have the immense spiritual pressure that came with the bloodlust like she and Zaraki had. In fact, now that she took the time to look more closely, she couldn't feel any spiritual pressure coming from him at all, but that was impossible. The only explanation was that he was surprising it so much it was invisible to her. What could have scared the boy so much that he would go out of his way to fight his nature, a nature that she knew about all too well? It had taken her meeting the current Kenpachi for her to realize what she had become, what Zaraki was now. She truly hated the captain of the 11th Division. He was a constant reminder of what she had been, what she could still be if she didn't fight her nature and allowed herself to fall. But what had scared Naruto Uzumaki so much that he had started fighting before he even truly fell into his nature? Without thinking, Hana found her eyes slowly falling to the Zanpakuto at the blonde's hip, tightly wrapped in bandages. He handled it like a killer, but the moment he got a chance would return it to his side as if it would bite him, as if he was truly afraid of it. Izan had told her that Naruto had changed in his second year at the academy, that he had started wrapping his blade at the same time, refusing to use it for spars. The only answer was that Naruto had learned his Zanpakuto's name, learned what it could do and what was in his soul, and it scared him so much he had done the same thing she herself had tried to do by joining the 4th Division. But even when she had learned the true nature of her Zanpakuto after attaining Bankai, Hana had continued to carve a path of blood and death everywhere she went, and it was without a doubt one of the most gruesome powers. Even if it was never officially registered to compare it to others, Hana knew that it was a terrible thing to wield. If her Zanpakuto wasn't enough to shock her out of her bloodlust, what did that say about Naruto's, about him? Unfortunately, before she could think any more about the matter, Hana felt her eyes widen as Izan released her Shikai. Izan, her kind, often shy vice captain, had just released her Shikai in a spar against a free graduate. Frowning, having let this go on long enough, having seen what she needed to, Yunohana pulled the door open and called out, and getting both Shinigami's attention. Izan, that is enough. Reseal you Zanpakuto this instant. Both turning to look at the captain in shock. The fact she didn't have her customary smile on her face, and the stern edge in her voice being so out of character, it was enough for the vice captain to lose her concentration and made her Zanpakuto reseal itself. Her eye wide, Izan seemed to come out of some kind of trance, shaking her head slightly before bowing. Captain Yunohana, I didn't know you were there. I can see that. Uzumaki-san, go to my office and wait for me. Have something I need to discuss with you. Izan, stay here, I have something to say to you first. Without a word, Naruto left the room with nothing but a bow at both women as he passed, closing the door behind him. The moment his footsteps faded into the distance, Yunohana turned to look at her vice captain, her usual smile on her face and ki in the air. Izan-san, explain. I don't know what came over me, Captain Yunohana. I was just so angry that he was mocking me I acted without thinking. Letting out a sigh, the long-haired captain shook her head slightly, making Izan feel like a small child being chastised by her mother. Izan-san, he was not mocking you, in fact he was going out of his way to avoid it. Uzumaki-san is not something you will ever be able to understand, and that is not a bad thing, but you must be more careful in the future. I understand, Captain Yunohana, it will not happen again. Nodding, Yunohana turned to leave the room, only to pause and turn back to her. I know it will not. Izan, you are an excellent healer, and you work hard to perfect your medical skills. However, I am sorry to say, Izan, because of your actions here I do not feel comfortable with you as my vice captain anymore. Not only has this proven that you have been neglecting your training, but your actions make me question your ability to make decisions. Please hand me your badge. Her eyes widening, tears falling down her face at her captain's words. Izan slowly reached down and removed her vice captain badge and handed it over without a word. As he stood waiting in the captain's office, Naruto couldn't think of anything but just how much trouble he was going to be in. After all, he did just show up the vice captain, in front of the captain. What if she kicked him out of the 4th division? He would undoubtedly be moved to the 11th, which would mean he would be forced to start fighting on a regular basis again, and if that happened it would only be a matter of time before. He couldn't even think about what would happen. I don't know what you're so worried about, Naru-chan. I think it would do us both good to feel the thrill of a good fight again. It's been so long, and I want to feel blood on my metal. You can't fight who you are forever. Ignoring the mental words of his Zanpakuto, Naruto took several deep breaths, trying to calm down. It worked just in time for the door behind him to open, Captain Yunohana walking in without a care in the world and a small smile on her lips, as if nothing had happened. Without even glancing at him, she walked over to her desk, sitting down in her seat, and started moving several papers around on her desk. This continued for the next 2 minutes, no words being exchanged between them, and just as Naruto was about to speak the captain placed her hand on the desk. The doors behind him slammed closed with a bang, the curtains closing over the widow behind her desk, and the walls flashed blue. His eyes widening, looking around the room quickly, Naruto opened his mouth only to once again be stopped when Yunohana started talking. I have been patient with you this last week, Uzumaki-san, despite my instincts telling me you were holding something back. But now I have reached my limit, and expect answers. I have sealed this room so nothing outside will know what is happening. If you continue to refuse I will send you to a different division by the end of the day, understood? For a moment all Naruto could do was stare at his captain, a mixture of fear and acceptance on his face, before he gave a small nod. Good, now release your spiritual pressure. Eye widening, Naruto was about to protest, but a small spike in ki made him lower his head, the words dying on his lips. Of course, Captain. Reaching for his Zanpakuto, Naruto slowly pulled it from his hip as not to seem threatening, and started to unwrap the bandages and letting them fall on the floor. The moment the last of the bandage was removed Yunohana felt her eyes widen in surprise as the air suddenly became thick from the spiritual pressure no saturating it, making several objects around the room start to vibrate and in some cases shatter. It was as if a wave had crashed into her body, leaving her sat water, her limbs feeling slightly sluggish. It wasn't enough to affect her outwardly, but without a doubt would leave anyone below vice captain, maybe even captain rank on their knees, or worse. This was the missing piece of the puzzle that she needed to confirm her suspicions, her eye moving to the bandages, realizing that what they must have been made of. Nodding her head, Hana motioned for Naruto to take a seat in front of her, the blonde doing so after a moment of hesitation. I was watching your spar with Izan-san from the start. Uzumaki-san, you are very skilled, and from what I am feeling now you have the raw power to back it up. I also saw something that worries me, something in your eyes. She saw the look of realization that crossed his face at her words, telling her that he knew exactly what she was talking about, before it gave way to a deep sadness. I see you know what I am talking about, good. Now tell me why you are hiding yourself in my division, when you should be placed somewhere that will cultivate your skills. As it stands, you have spiritual pressure to rival a captain, and from what I saw of your brief spar with Izan-san, at least high vice-captain skills. If this was known to others, you would be hailed as a prodigy the likes of Captain Hitsugaya. Not meeting her eyes, Naruto's hand slowly moved across his still-sheathed Zanpakuto, which was currently laying on his lap. Not missing the action, Hana frowned slightly, leaning forward to get a better look at the blade for herself. Uzumaki-san, what is your Zanpakuto's name? Suddenly looking straight at her, his eyes wide in fear, Naruto seemed to struggle for a moment before his shoulders slumped and a sigh came from his lips. Kurama, her name is Kurama? And what is it, exactly that Kurama does that has you so afraid you will not even use her while in her sealed form, Uzumaki-san? For a moment, Hana thought Naruto wasn't going to say anything, as his eyes fell to the floor and he seemed to fall in on himself. But just as she was about to ask again, the blonde Shinigami looked up, his eyes locking on her own. She hunts. Frowning at the vague answer, Hana kept her eyes on his for a moment longer, before letting out a sigh and nodding her head. Very well, but one day I want you to either tell or show me just what you mean by that. But until then, there has been a change of plans on who your training partner will be. Getting a confused expression, Naruto reached down and slowly started to rewrap the bandages around his Zanpakuto, looking at her the whole time. Captain Hana, starting first thing tomorrow, I will be training you myself, in my private training ground away from the eyes of the rest of the 4th Division. Izan-san is not strong enough to challenge you. In fact, I am sure no one but myself in the 4th Division that can train with you. Eyes widening, Naruto sat straight in his chair, staring at Hana as if she had grown a second head. Only for them to get wider when she placed the vice-captain badge in front of him. Also, you will be wearing this from now on. I will explain everything you will need to know tomorrow. Wear it at all times, and be sure to act appropriately for your new position. There is a vice-captain meeting every Thursday at 6 p.m. in the 10th Division barracks. Captain Hana, I don't understand, what about Izan-san? Letting out a tired sigh, Hana leaned back in her seat, a sad smile on her face. Izan-san is a good healer, she works hard in any and everything medical, but she is not a fighter. Nor is she a leader, her usual shy personality makes her unfit to give orders, and from what I saw when you spared she is not as level-headed as I thought her to be. You however, despite being fresh out of the academy, are already at a vice-captain level. You can fight, even if you refuse to acknowledge it, and even though you have only been here a week I have heard nothing but good things from the other members. Seeing that he was still confused, Hana closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about the best way to word it. Naruto-san, as you know the 4th Division is looked down on by the others, they think because we focus on things other than combat that we are cowards. For years they have treated my subordinates as less than trash, and no matter what I do, I am only one person. I need a strong vice-captain, to prove the 4th Division is not weak, and I believe you are that person. I don't know, Captain Hana. What would people say of you replacing Izan-san with a freshly graduated Shinigami? Also, I'm not even sure I can train anymore, even against someone as strong as you. Frowning, Hana stood up, letting her ki leak out slightly, her smile on her face. If I didn't know better, Uzumaki-san, I would think that was arrogance. Eye widening in horror, Naruto quickly stood up and gave a low bow. I meant no disrespect, Captain Hana. I merely meant that, I cannot use my Zanpakuto on a fellow Shinigami, even in her sealed form. Kurama will hunt the blood of anyone she has tasted. Just one drop is all she needs. Frowning at his words, her mind filling with even more questions about just what this young Shinigami's Zanpakuto did, Hana gave a small nod. After all, she would never use her own against a fellow Shinigami while in Bankai, even in a spar against another captain. Very well, I will not ask you any more questions for now, but I am also not giving you a choice. You are the new vice captain of the 4th Division, and you will meet me here tomorrow at 8 AM for training. Do not be late, Naruto-san. Without another word, Hana tossed the vice captain badge to Naruto, before turning her attention back to the paperwork on her desk as the blonde left. The next day Naruto arrived at the captain's office with 10 minutes to spare, not wanting to risk her getting angry with him again, and when he saw that there was no light on inside decided to wait for her to arrive. The reactions of the other members of the 4th Division when they saw the vice captain's badge on his belt had been interesting, to say the least. Most had seemed confused, not sure what had happened, but didn't have the confidence to question it, though he did hear them talking about it as they walked past him. Others seemed angry, not liking that Izan had been replaced by a fresh graduate, or that they had been overlooked themselves when they had been around longer. A few had congratulated him, but not many, and they didn't look him in the eye when they did. He had also ran into Izan after Hana had given him the badge yesterday, and the moment she saw it, the silver-haired Shinigami had frozen. Her eyes widening and tears falling down her face, she had turned her back on him as ran away without a word, making Naruto feel terrible. He didn't want this, any of it, but he couldn't say no to his captain. Kurama was loving it, and seemed to think that because he was promoted would mean he was going to have to use her soon, and Naruto was worried that she was right. Vice captains were deployed as backup in the field all the time as a quick response until more unranked Shinigami could be assembled, and no matter how strong he was Naruto couldn't kill a hollow without unsheathing his Zanpakuto. The sound of footsteps moving towards him brought Naruto out of his thoughts, and the moment he saw Hana walk around the corner at the end of the hall he stood up straight, one hand on his Zanpakuto and the at his side. Captain Hana. Smiling at him, Hana nodded in acknowledgement, stopping several feet in front of him. Naruto-san, you are on time. Good, we can get started then. Follow me, please. Without another word, Hana turned her back to him and started walking away, Naruto quickly moving to follow behind her. She led him through the barracks, which despite being early was buzzing with activity, the members of the 4th Division always getting up early for chores. After about 5 minutes of walking, they came to a door with a lock, the sign next to it on the wall claiming it to be out of bounds to anyone but Captain Hana. He watched as she pulled a key from inside her robes and unlocked the door, before stepping to the side and motioning him to go in, closing the door behind her when she followed. The room was dark, too dark to see anything inside, but the moment Hana flicked the light switch Naruto could only stare in surprise. He found himself stood in a giant training ground, at least 3 times the size as the one used by the rest of the 4th Division, the lights filling the room completely. The ground was uneven, made to act like a natural environment so it would be harder to move around unless you were paying attention, with several rocks placed in random spots and even a medium-sized pond. This room has the same protection as my office, meaning no one outside these walls can see, hear or feel what happens inside. I want you to unwrap your Zanpakuto again, and get into a stance. I need to judge your skills firsthand. Walking past him and moving to stand in the middle of the room, Hana slowly unsheathed her own blade, holding it out in front of her with the same smile on her face. His eyes widening, Naruto's hand shot to his hilt, taking a step back without realizing it. But Captain Hana, I can't draw my Zanpakuto against you. I did not ask you to, Naruto-san. I asked you to get into a stance. You can keep your blade sheathed if you must, for now at least, but I want you to unbind it so I can evaluate your spiritual pressure while I test you. Letting out a sigh, though still not liking the situation, Naruto gave a small nod and unwrapped the bandages. Just like the day before, the moment the last part of the cloth fell away, Naruto's spiritual pressure burst out of his body, covering the whole room in seconds. He couldn't help but feel relieved. The feeling of having his spiritual pressure constantly suppressed was not the most comfortable in the world, his eyes closing for a moment as the tension in his shoulders disappeared. After adjusting, Naruto quickly moved to stand across from his captain, his still sheathed Zanpakuto in his hand. He got into the same stance he used against Izan, one that Kurama had taught him, saying it was how she was meant to be held. For a moment neither of them moved, other than at the start when Hana gave a small nod of her head, just standing in their stances and waiting for the silent signal to start. Naruto knew he would be able to do the same thing he had against Izan. This was a captain after all, and had no illusion that he would win this spar. But he also knew that if he didn't at least try, Hana would not be happy with him, and that scared him. When 5 minutes had passed and they still hadn't moved, Naruto finally reached his breaking point and, tensing his leg muscles, made his move. Because the space they were in was so much bigger than the one he had faced Izan in the day before, Naruto knew that he wouldn't be able to just close it by running over without leaving himself wide open, so instead took a step and used Shunpo. Instantly appearing in front of Hana, who showed no surprise at all at his sudden appearance, Naruto aimed his Zanpakuto for the side of her head. Only for Hana to easily bring her sword up to block it, before diverting it to the right, causing Naruto to stumble slightly as he lost his balance. Quickly recovering, Naruto used Anther Shunpo to get away before she could attack, only to find that she hadn't moved an inch after diverting his attack. "You can do better, Naruto-san. I know you can, so stop holding back and come at me." Fighting the sudden rush of adrenaline that shot through his body at her words and attitude, along with the bloodlust that came with it, Naruto shook his head to clear it before once again Shunpoing over to her, appearing on her left side this time. He aimed a strike at her ribs, twisting his body slightly so as to build up more momentum and out more power behind it, only for his eyes to widen in shock as it was brushed away by the back of her hand, once again making him lose his balance. Shunpoing away again, Naruto reappeared panting and sweating, one hand moving to hold the side of his head as he grit his teeth. He wasn't tired, if anything he was the opposite, so much adrenaline was pulsing through his veins right now that he was shaking. Closing his eyes, Naruto took a moment to calm himself down, before locking his eyes back on Hana. This time he shunpoed into the air above her, his Zanpakuto held above his head as he brought it down on hers with as much strength as he could, a guttural war cry escaping his lips. Instead of diverting it this time, however, Hana took a step back, completely avoiding the strike, resulting in it hitting the ground and leaving a small crater. Then, before he could shunpo away again, her hand shot out and a small knife came from her sleeve and hit him in the left shoulder. Letting out a small gasp, Naruto reappeared on the other side of the room again, one hand holding his shoulder to try and slow the blood. The pain was intense, the knife had gone in up to the hilt and was wedged between his shoulder joint, and every time he moved it Naruto could feel the metal grinding against the bone. He pulled his hand away and looked at the blood covering his hand, his eyes widening, unable to look away as several drops hit the floor. This was the moment Hana had been waiting for. The look in Naruto's eyes had still been dull up to this point, telling her he was still holding back. She had been looking for his trigger, the thing that would set him off and release his bloodlust, and had seen the way he was fighting it. But the moment he saw the blood on his hand, Hana knew she had found it, and that the spar was about to get a lot more interesting. She watched as his breathing became more labored, his eyes widening to a painful degree, and his body began to shake with suppressed excitement. His lips slowly began to pull back into a large grin, showing all his teeth, as he slowly looked away from his hand and met her gaze. "Now Naruto-san, show me the real you, show me everything." His grin stretching even wider, Hana watched as, with a sharp flick of his wrist, the sheath shot off his Zanpakuto, hitting the wall and clattering to the floor. He got into a low stance, bending at the knees and leaning forward, Zanpakuto at his side. The ground under his feet started to creak and splinter as he tensed the muscles in his legs, the spiritual pressure in the air getting even thicker, reaching to double what it was before and still climbing. Without warning, the ground under his feet exploded, Naruto shunpoing right in front of her, his Zanpakuto already mid-swing. While impressive, it was still not enough, and Hana diverted it away from her without effort, sending sharks off both blades from where they touched. With flick of her wrist, another knife shot out of her sleeve and into the back of Naruto's right leg, making him stumble. However, unlike the last time he was hit with one of her knives, Naruto showed no other sign of being in pain. He seemed to brush it off within seconds, not even bothering to pull the blade out as he turned around and swung at her again, the grin on his face not changing in the slightest. Putting all his weight on his left leg, Naruto pivoted on the spot and aimed a swipe at her stomach, his other leg hanging limply. Hana diverted the blade again, before doing the same with her free hand to the kick from the blonde's injured leg, and taking a step back. This time, instead of throwing the knife, Hana held it in her hand and slashed, catching his right forearm and sending blood shoot through the air. But she was quickly learning that, just like herself and Zaraki, Naruto was unaffected by his injuries. In fact, they seemed to only make him stronger, the sight of his own blood fueling his bloodlust. It made her wonder what would happen if he saw someone else's blood. But before she could put more thought into it, Hana's attention was brought back to the fight as she used her hand to divert a swing aimed for her neck, making it go up. She took this moment to slash his face with the knife still in her hand, once again opening a cut on his forehead, and sending his blood into the air before kicking him away. He landed on his feet after correcting himself in the air, the grin still in place and his eyes bloodshot with excitement as the blood from the cut she just faced him dripped down his face, his tongue shooting out and catching a little as it reached his cheek. The sight made her frown. This was going too far. She had only wanted to get him excited enough to see his bloodlust in action, but if this continued he would end up in a hospital bed by the end of the spar. As it was, she could still easily heal him, the wounds inflicted so far, while bloody, being only minor. But if they didn't stop soon he would only get more excited and may even release his Shikai, which while she was still interested in, Hana knew from his actions before the spar would not be good for future training. However, she also knew that in his current state, Naruto would not be able to stop. Quickly thinking up a strategy, Hana waited for him to charge at her again, only to sidestep at the last moment and slam the butt of her Zanpakuto into the back of his head. Naruto was unconscious before he hit the ground, his sword skidding across the floor, coming to a stop next to one of the boulders about 10 feet away. Letting out a sigh, Hana returned her Zanpakuto to its sheath on her hip, before calmly walking over to the blonde Shinigami. After pulling out both her knives and returning them to their places in her sleeve, not even bothering to clean them first, she took a moment to check his injuries before healing them one at a time, thinking over what she had learned about the blonde. It was just like she had thought. Naruto Uzumaki was like her and Zaraki, with an unbelievable spiritual pressure and bloodlust unmatched by anything else. It was a condition that appeared at random, and so far she, Zaraki and Naruto were the only people she had met that had it. They were born with raw power unmatched by all but a few, but with it came a love and lust for battle that drove them to seek it out over everything else. It was as much, if not more so, of a cure than a blessing. In a way, Hana was happy that Naruto had ended up in her care instead of that man's, knowing what his influence would lead to. If nothing else, Naruto Uzumaki was destined to be a big player in the Seirei, just like her and Zaraki. At least now, she would be able to lead him down a different path than they had, maybe even teach him to control his bloodlust. The thought brought a small smile to her face, and after making sure he was completely healed, move him over to the wall and propped him up against it. 10 years later, Naruto stood behind his captain in the meet silently, just like he had been taught, his back straight and a small smile not unlike her on his face. Not much had happened over the last 10 years, besides training and learning about his vice-captain duties, and although the paperwork made him cringe, Naruto was happy to have joined the 4th division. Since he became the vice-captain, the only real hiccups had been his first time meeting the other vice-captains, and when he had been called to a captain's meet. Several of his fellow vice-captains liked the idea of Izan being replaced even less than his division did, and had acted cold to him at first just to spite him, blaming him for her being demoted. Fortunately that had changed when they actually took the time to get to know him. The captains however did not seem to like him for the most part, mostly because Hana had promoted him but not given a reason other than they should trust her judgment. Naruto was sure that, if everyone wasn't so scared of her, he would have at least been forced into a spar against one of the other vice-captains by now just to prove he had the skill. In fact, Hana had made it so that she was the only one he could spar with, and only while in her private training ground. She never actually taught him anything, other than the odd bit of advice while they were fighting, and for the most part they would just spar for hours at a time. At the end of each spar Naruto would wake up unconscious, with all his wounds healed and his cloths covered in blood. He had never even been about to leave a scratch on her skin once. In the last 10 years they had been training, something Naruto was more than happy about. He had still not released his Shikai against her, or any other Shinigami in the least 10 years, and he still feared it. Hana had never forced him to show her, despite the fact he knew she wanted to know, and that was something he would always be grateful for. Naruto hadn't even been called into the field before, his captain pulling strings to keep him off the front line, so to speak. Using the time to refine his skills, giving him more fighting experience, even if it wasn't the same as fighting a hollow. But that was about to change. Both he and Hana, along with 2 members of the 11th Division, were being deployed to the outskirts of Soul Society. Apparently, several hollow had been spotted in the area, and at least one of them was supposed to be in Ajukas. The 2 11th Division members were the current 3rd and 5th seat, Akaku Madarame and Yumachika Yasugawa respectively, and neither looked all that happy about being sent out with him. Hana was only coming along as backup, and wouldn't be involved in the fighting unless needed. Naruto knew what was happening, why he was being sent out, and was only surprised it hadn't happened sooner. Hana had basically run out of favors, and wasn't about to keep him hidden anymore, either that or she thought it was time for him to show himself to the Gode 13. He knew that there would be at least one member of the 2nd Division following them on his mission, and that they would be reporting on everything that happened. He didn't miss the small nod that Hana sent him when she saw him glancing at her, obviously knowing what he was thinking, and confirming his suspicions. It was also her way of telling him it was time for him to stop hiding. Putting those thoughts to the back of his mind for now, Naruto focused on the Captain Commander as he gave them their mission. It has been reported that a number of hollow, at least one of them being in Ajukas, have been sighted in the East 56th district of Rukongai. You 4 are to go and investigate, and deal with any hollows you may or may not find, before returning. Captain Hana will be accompanying you, but will only intervene if she feels you need her assistance, and will be keeping me up to date of what is happening. From our last report, it is estimated that there are 5 hollow working in a group, and as I already said at least one of them is Ajuka's level from what the 12th Division scanners have been about to pick up. They all nodded their heads to show their understanding. Good, you are all dismissed. The trip to the East 56th district of Rukongai was long. At least it felt like it was to Naruto, having to listen to Akaku ranting about how he wanted to fight, and Yumachika talking about how beautiful he was while staring into the hand mirror he brought. It also didn't help that they both were very vocal about their thoughts on how cowardly most of the 4th Division were, and how that meant Naruto probably didn't even know how to use his Zanpakuto. If it didn't keep grabbing his shoulder to stop him, Naruto would have knocked them both out within the first 5 minutes. Akaku talking about fighting wasn't helping either, because over the last 10 years his bloodlust had only gotten worse. Fighting Hana every day seemed to only make it stronger. Just the thought of a fight would make his blood pump, and he wanted nothing more than to give in to Kurama's wish and draw her against the bold-headed Shinigami. But he wouldn't, not against a comrade, not matter how annoying they were. It took them 2 days to reach their destination, a small village on the edge of the 55th and 56th district, only an hour's walk from the last sighting. It wasn't much to look, the houses being run down and the one road that cut through it uneven with several potholes. Though the people didn't seem too bad, not overly friendly, but polite enough. They arrived just before nightfall, so instead of heading straight out decided to spend the night at the only hotel in the village. Well, it wasn't really a hotel so much as a slightly bigger house with 2 spare rooms that you could rent for a night, but the old woman that owned it was nice. Because there were only 2 rooms, Naruto ended up bunking with Hana, much to both their embarrassment, but it was better than sharing with either of their other traveling companions. Naruto spent the night sleeping on the floor, insisting his captain take the bed, with a blanket the owner had let him use. The next morning they woke with the sun along it seems with most of the village, the people making a living from farming the fields nearby, and after paying for their rooms set off at a sedate pace for the 56th district. It took longer than they had planned to arrive at their destination. Having to walk up a mountain had slowed them down considerably, especially since they weren't using Shunpo to save their energy for the hollows. As they got closer, the terrain started to get harsher and the foliage thicker until it was almost impossible to see where they were going, which only served to slow them down even more, until they finally emerged into a small clearing. There were several broken trees, and ground was torn up slightly in places, making it clear they were in the right place. Standing next to his captain as Akaku ran forward, his sword out and a grin on his face, Naruto could only shake his head when he saw the bold man finally realize that there were no hollows around. Hey, where are they? Letting out a sigh, Naruto looked to his captain for permission, before stepping forward when she gave him a small nod. Walking around the clearing, bending down to look at several footprints or broken branches, before nodding to himself. Naruto had always been good at tracking, a skill he had had before he even started at the academy, and one Hana had encouraged him to refine over the last 10 years. They left about 2 hours ago, traveling north-northwest. 5 sets of prints, 2 belonging to 4-legged creatures, 2 belonging to 2-legged and the last with a serpent-like tail. Based on the fact that several of the higher branches on the trees are broken, and that there is only 4 sets leaving the clearing, one of them is a flyer. The 2 4-legged hollows are heavy and powerful, based on the deep impressions in the ground, but will most likely be slow. The flying is one of the toe-legged, and the other is light on his feet, so speed-based. Unfortunately, I can't tell much about the snake tail. Its weight is evenly distributed, so there isn't much of an impression, but it is long. Looking up, Naruto was met with the smiling face of his captain, and 2 shocked faces from both Akaku and Yumachika. It took about a minute before the battle-crazy Shinigami was able to speak. "How the hell do you know all that? I thought this was supposed to be your first time in the field." Taking a leaf out of his captain's book, Naruto let a small, innocent smile cross his face, only without the killing intent. "I'm good at tracking." Moving to stand next to Hana again, Naruto pointed in the direction they needed to go, one hand on his Zanpakuto. "We should be able to catch up to them within the hour. They are traveling as a ground and the 2 4-legged hollows will probably slow them down because of the thick foliage. When we meet up with them, I would suggest you 2 deal with them quickly, while I keep an eye out for the flyer. The other 2-legged and snake-tail we can deal with as needed." They both gave him strange looks, and for a moment Naruto was worried they weren't going to listen and brush his words off. But after they shared a look, both Akaku and Yumachika shrugged and started walking in the direction he pointed. It was just like Naruto had predicted. Within an hour they had caught up with the group of hollows, the trail getting easier to follow through the closer they got. He had also been right about what they looked like, and that the 2 4-legged hollows had slowed them down. Though they couldn't see the flyer at the moment. The first looked to be a giant boar-type hollow, standing a head taller than Naruto himself, with blue markings on its mask and 2-foot-long tusks pointing forward. The second was an equally giant bull-type hollow, with red markings on its mask, but instead of only 2 horns had a third curving forward from the top of its head. The one with a snake-like body was just that, a snake-type hollow, but with 3 heads and a blade-like spike on the end of the tail. Each mask looked the same, except for the color of the markings on each, which were green, black and brown from left to right. The last in the group that they could see had a human-like shape and size, but was so skinny it looked like nothing but bones, with a long neck. It was all sharp and pointy, with foot-long spikes coming out of both its knees and elbows, with long bone fingers ending in claws and a segmented tail twice as long as its body with a bladed tip. It stood on 3, the rest of its foot going straight into its leg. The back of its head tapered off into a 2-foot-long curved spike. They were clearly waiting for them, having stopped in a field so it would be easier for the boar and bull to move. And the moment they stepped into it, both 4-legged hollows charged at them at full speed, heads low and horns ready to gore. Without a word, both Akaku and Yumachika charged to meet them head-on, the bold Shinigami with a large grin on his face, and the other with a small smirk. Turning his attention away from the 2 and their fight, Naruto focused on his own as the snake hollow moved in front of him, all 3 heads hissing at him and moving around randomly. Without even taking out his Zanpakuto, he stepped back, avoiding the bladed tail that came over their heads aimed at his chest, resulting in it digging into the ground at his feet. Without taking his eyes off the head, Naruto stepped forward again, stomping his foot on the tail with enough force to snap the bladed end off. Letting out a scream of pain and anger, the snake hollow pulled its tail back and snapped at him with the right head, curling its injured tail into a coil behind it. Stepping back again, Naruto grabbed his Zanpakuto, hitting the head that struck at him with the sheath as he got into his stance. "Naruto-san, unbind your Zanpakuto." Pausing in his stance, Naruto turned to look at his captain with wide eyes, before turning his attention back to the Sake hollow when the middle and left head struck at him. Frowning for letting himself get distracted, Naruto closed his eyes for a moment, before letting out a sigh. Grabbing the end of the wrapping, Naruto threw his Zanpakuto into the air and gave a sharp pull, unwinding the bandages and making it spin fast enough to generate a small gust of wind. The moment the bandage was removed, the air in the field was filled with his spiritual pressure, and everything stopped moving for a moment to stare at him in shock as he grabbed his Zanpakuto from the air. The moment it was in his hand, Naruto pivoted on the spot, flicking his wrist and sending his sheath shooting off to the side where it embedded itself into a tree. His face suddenly shadowed by his hair. Naruto let a large grin cross his lips as he gave himself over to the bloodlust, just like Hana had taught him. When he tilted his head back up, the snake-like hollow recoiled in fear, not looking like it wanted to fight when it saw the hungry look in his eyes. Without warning, Naruto lunged forward, one head shooting out and grabbing the left head and pulling it forward, while swinging his sword at the right head at the same time. Being the only free head, the one in the middle let out a pain-filled scream as the right was severed, falling to the ground with a wet sound, several spots of blood hitting Naruto in the face. In a show of strength, his grin growing even larger at the act of bloodshed, Naruto gave a sharp pull and lifted the snake-like hollow over his head and slammed it into the ground. The force leaving a large crater, he followed up by bringing his Zanpakuto down on the joint where the two remaining head connected, cutting them clean in half all the way down the body in one seing. Throwing the now head hollow off to the side as it started to disintegrate, his body now covered in even more blood than before, Naruto's eyes locked on the boar like hollow Yumachika was fighting. Flipping his sword in his hand so he was holding it more like a spear, Naruto threw it straight at the hollow's neck, following after it the moment it left his hand. Ignoring the surprised look the 11th Division 5th seat gave when his Zanpakuto sank into the boar's neck, causing it to squeal in pain, Naruto jumped into the air, grabbing his hilt as he passed over it, and used the momentum to cut its head from its shoulders. It was at this point the flying hollow finally made its appearance. It looked like a human-sized bat, with a 20-foot wingspan, a long bony tail and 3 clawed toes on each foot. It had no eye holes on its mask, but there were 2 large ears on either side of its head, and a pair of fangs 2 foot long curving down from its mouth. It also had a short snout-like nose that took up most of its face, its nostrils flaring, and red markings. It came swooping down from the sky, grabbing onto the blonde Shinigami's shoulders with his clawed feet, before lifting back into the air before anyone could stop it. Within seconds Naruto was carried 100 feet into the air, the bat-like hollow's long tail moving wrapping around his neck like a snake, but the grin never left his lips as Naruto stabbed his Zanpakuto up and into its ribcage. With an eye-splitting screech, the bat hollow realized its hold on Naruto, dropping him as it tried to get away, only for him to grab its tail as he fell. The hollow lost its balance, causing both it and Naruto to spiral down and back into the field, landing with a thump in the middle between the other Shinigami and the human-like hollow. The moment his feet hit the ground, Naruto gave another strong pull, swinging the bat hollow around by its tail, before letting go and sending it flying into a tree. Hee, you're stronger than I expected, Shinigami Scrum, I'll enjoy ripping the flesh from your bones. Bringing his Zanpakuto up just in time, Naruto came face to face with the human-like hollow, its claws inched from his throat and being held back by his Zanpakuto. His grin stretching to an impossible degree, the blonde Shinigami licked his lips in excitement, eyes wide and bloodshot. So you're the Ajukas, I was hoping I'd get to fight you. Pulling away, two disappeared from sight for a moment, before reappearing 20 feet away from each other. Crouching low, the hollow was about to charge again, only to pause when it felt the spiritual pressure in the air suddenly double in size, only to become visible as red wisps of energy and be sucked into Naruto's Zanpakuto. It continued to be sucked in, until the sword couldn't take anymore and it started to go into Naruto instead. The power slowly built up more and more by the second, until it took the shape of a giant grinning fox head, with Naruto stood inside it. His face suddenly taking on a much calmer expression, Naruto slowly brought up his Zanpakuto in front of his face, grabbing the base of the blade with his left hand. Everything was still, the bull hollow having been killed by Ikaku already, except for the howling of the wind as the spiritual pressure continued to be pulled into the blonde. Then, with a quick jerking motion, Naruto ran his hand up his own blade, leaving a trail of blood along it, and spoke 2 words. Hunt, Kurama. The light that radiated out from Naruto blinded everyone that saw it, the fox head exploding outwards with a gust of wind, blowing everything away from him. Hana was forced to shield her eyes like everyone else as she skidded back from the power, leaving 2 small trenches in the ground where her feet dug in. This was the moment she had been waiting the least 10 years to see, patiently waiting for the battle that would have Naruto release his Shikai, because no matter how much she pushed him in their spars he would never use it against her. She hadn't even been able to get him to tell her what it did beyond the usual hunt he would always give as an answer. It seemed he was just as afraid of what people would think of him for what his Zanpakuto could do, as he was to use it against another Shinigami. After all, his Zanpakuto was an extension of the Shinigami's soul, as much a part of them as they were it, and for some it was a hard thing to face. But when the light finally faded, the wind having kicked up a small cloud of dust, Hana made sure to take in every detail of her vice captain's Shikai, memorizing every line into her mid. The sleeves of his Shinigami robe were gone, along with his sword, replaced by blood-red gauntlets. They covered his arms to his shoulders and connected across his back, and seemed to be made from thousands of 2-inch-long metal needles, giving them the appearance of fur. Each finger was tipped with a small, claw-like scythe, the metal a deep black color that seemed to suck in the light. His arms seemed to have grown about 2 foot longer, his hands several times their normal size, but it didn't look to affect his balance. On each shoulder where the gauntlets ended, were 3-foot-long needles, framing his head on either side. In the middle of his shoulder blades where the two connected, was a line traveling down his spine made from the same red needles, before moving on into a long bushy fox-tailed twice the length of his body and swaying as if it were real. She watched as the dust finally cleared, Naruto crouching slightly like some kind of animal, his teeth bared in a snarl as his eyes locked on the hollow in front of him. With every movement, the needles would click together slightly, making an almost rattling sound fill the air. To the hollow's credit, it only took one step back before regaining its confidence, getting into a crouch of its own with its clawed hands at its side. But Hana couldn't tear her eyes away from Naruto, his arms covered in his Shikai and new tails swaying behind him. But that didn't make any sense, it was too advanced for a Shikai, looking and feeling more like a Bankai. She still didn't understand why he was so afraid to use it, but also knew that it had something to do with blood, and that she wasn't going to see what it did until he cut the hollow deep enough to get some. Hana also felt more, then saw the two 11th Division members moving to stand on her right, both even more entranced by Naruto's appearance than her, with their eyes wide and mouths open in shock. She could still feel his spiritual pressure in the air around them, pressing against her body, her very soul. But it also felt more controlled than before, calmer than when he gave in to his bloodlust, and that actually worried her a little. It was like they were now stood in the eye of the storm. At some unseen signal, both Naruto and the hollow disappear from sight, only to reappear again in the middle as they clashed. Their clawed hands meeting at the same time, the strength sending a gust of wind outward from their bodies, seemingly matched in strength. The needle rattled even louder, as if they were excited about the blood they would soon feel, reacting to the fight. They separated, only charge at each other again a moment, sparks flying into the air where their claws met. Naruto aimed a swipe at the hollow's chest with his left hand, but was blocked by the blade on the end of its tail, his metal claws leaving deep scratches. Jumping back, Naruto pulled his arms tight into his sides, and started rolling forward so fast his body became a red blur. The ground under him was torn apart by the fur-like needles, the blonde Shinigami's body turning into a wheel of death, before it shot forward at the hollow as if it were shot from a cannon. It was able to jump to the side, barely avoiding being run over, and Naruto continued forward and destroyed 3 trees. The spinning Shinigami tore through them as if they were paper, shredding them into splinters in seconds, before making a wide turn and coming back at the hollow. This continued for several minutes, the Ajukas dodging but unable to attack without getting caught by the needles, until Naruto finally stopped spinning. The moment he did, the hollow lunged forward, his clawed fingers aiming at his face. Only to swerve to the right when Naruto brought up his needle-covered arm to block. They ended up facing each other head-on again, and as one both charged at the other at the same time, meeting in the middle. They locked hands again, fighting for dominance as, pushing against each other. Then came the tails, both coming from over their owner's head, only to meet in the air and knot themselves together in a fight for dominance. They jerked around wildly, pushing and pulling against each other more than the clawed hands still locked together. With a growl, they both pulled away at the same time, but kept their tails locked. Both fell into almost identical crouches on the ground on all fours, their tails seeming to get longer to accommodate the new space between them. For about a minute it became a fight of strength between the two tails, Naruto and the Hollow jumping around on all fours, trying to gain the better ground to overpower the other. It was broken however when, the needles rattling louder than before, a shudder seemed to run along Naruto's arms before moving down his spine and along his tail. It only took a second for Hana to realize what had happened, as every needle that made up the fur-like armor suddenly stood on end, the only warning being the noise it made as they clicked against each other. With a scream of pain, the Hollow pulled its tail away, a tiny bit of blood dripping on the ground from the tiny pin pricks the needles had caused. It backed away from Naruto for a moment like a wounded animal, curling its tail around itself and glaring at the blonde. Is that all you can do? A few tiny pin pricks aren't going to kill me. Getting out of his crouch and standing up straight, Naruto held his arms out at his sides, with a cold expression on his face. One drop is all it takes for the hunt to begin, one drop on her medal, and Kurama will never forget your taste. She will hunt you no matter where you go, no matter how far you run, even if you killed me now she will still kill you after I am gone. You are already dead, you just don't know it yet. On the last word Naruto threw his arms forward in an exaggerated gesture, the rattling of the needles growing even louder than ever before, then they stopped. For a moment nothing happened, the field falling completely silent, as all eyes stayed glued to Naruto. Then, without warning, every needle burst from his body as one, shooting into the air in every direction. They moved as one, collecting together in a way that reminded Hana of a certain captain's Zanpakuto, grouping together above Naruto's head before shooting forward. But for a moment, before they moved, Hana could have sworn that they had taken the shape of a grinning fox head. However, what happened next surprised everyone as, instead of aiming at the human-like Hollow, the needles passed right by him, separating without touching him like water around a rock. But before anyone had time to wonder what had gone wrong, a screeching-like scream pierced the air, loud enough to hurt their ears. Taking her eyes away from her vice-captain and the Hollow, Hana felt them widen slightly at the sight of the bat-like Hollow, that had apparently still been alive. Hana had never felt sorry for a Hollow being in pain before, not even when using her own Zanpakuto Bankai, but the sight of the bat Hollow made her wince. The needles had pierced clean through every inch of the creature, even the parts covered in bone-like armor, tearing it to pieces and pinning what was left against the tree it had been stood in front of. It was at that moment that Hana finally understood why Naruto refused to ever use his unsheathed Zanpakuto against another Shinigami, hermit putting together every hint he had ever given her about what it did, and why he was so afraid of using it. Kurama was like a bloodhound, she would chance whatever she had the scent of, going from oldest to newest. Naruto didn't even have to release his Shikai, as she had just seen, because Kurama would use any blood that touched her metal. He didn't even have to direct the needles himself, maybe couldn't, because they would simply go after the blood of their victim. The fact that Naruto needed to cut himself to release her was odd, but Hana could only assume it was a price he had to pay for using such a powerful weapon, and also proved that he was the only person immune to this hunt he had been talking about. As these thoughts passed through her head, Hana watched as the needles pulled themselves out of the now disintegrating bat Hollow, once again returning to the air like a swarm of angry hornets as they grouped together. This time, there was no doubt in her mind as the needles formed into a grinning fox head with long, rabbit-like ears. The human-like Hollow, seeming to realize the danger it was in, suddenly took off into the trees. It moved fast, swinging from branches, running on the ground, and was out of sight before anyone could stop it. Naruto showed no sign of being worried, and it was at this point that Hana noticed that he still had the small scythe-like claws, having moved to rest on the ends of his fingers. He just watched as the fox-shaped needles turned to face the fleeing Ijukas, before bursting back into a swarm and shooting off and following, no, not following, chasing. She watched as they moved through the trees without touching them, the only sound being the slight rattling noise they made when touching each other, before they too disappeared into the distance. Within seconds a scream of pain and horror filled the air as the needles caught up with the unfortunate creature, only to be cut off short as everything fell quiet again, before the rattling of the needles returned as they came back. They came shooting out of the woods straight at Naruto, and for a moment Hana was worried she was wrong and they would kill him, only for them to start circling him without touching his skin. It was like watching an excited puppy playing with its owner, the needles rattling, darting in and out around him. Then they all started to glow, before merging together, returning to their sealed form, and the sword landing blade first in the ground at Naruto's feet. Ha! Who would have thought a 4th division work monkey could be a real fighter? I mean, the ending was less exciting, but at the start when you were fighting head-on, that was great. Keeping his head down as Akaku continued to talk about the fight, Naruto tried to ignore the excited bold Shinigami as he threw his arm around his shoulders, pulling him into a one-armed hug. And that light show, I've only ever seen Captain Kenpachi do anything like that. You got to tell me how you did it. Before Naruto could think of an answer, because he really didn't want to admit out loud he was the same as the 11th Division captain, they were both pulled from the conversation by Unohana. I think you have asked my vice captain enough questions, Madarame-san. We are almost at the village. Tomorrow, after a good night's sleep, we will return to the Seirei and give our report to the captain commander. Frowning, but still nodding in understanding, Akaku took his arm off of the blonde and moved to walk with his friend, who was once again looking into a mirror. After that they walked in silence, Unohana in front, Akaku and Yumachika in the back, and a still blood-soaked Naruto in the middle. He had actually forgotten about the blood. Strange how even when the rest of the hollows disintegrated, the blood remained, staining his body and clothes. Maybe it was supposed to be symbolic. He now looked on the outside, like he was on the inside. When they finally arrived at the village, the reactions of the people that lived there were as expected, but the looks still hurt. Wide-eyed fear, turning away whenever he looked in their direction. It brought back memories he didn't want to think about. They were able to get the same rooms as before, though the old woman that owned it refused to let Naruto inside until after he had had a bath, and had even taken his clothes to clean while he washed. Naruto was surprised. He didn't even know her name and she didn't know his, but while everyone else seemed to be scared of his blood-stained form, she acted like a stern grandmother. It was that thought that brought a small smile to the blonde's face as he soaked in the bath, after having scrubbed all of the dried hollow blood from his hair and skin, and let himself relax for the first time since the fight. It wasn't that he was tired, physically at least. Using his Shikai took almost no effort, which was just one more reason he feared it. No, the fact that by the time he returned to the Seirei everyone would know, that was weighing heavily on his mind. A Zanpakuto was the physical manifestation of the Shinigamis. Everything they were, was put into their sword, everything that made them who they were. So what did that make Naruto? A hunter? A killer? He knew it was possible to learn how to cancel a hunt. Though Kurama would always remember a person's blood and could return to it, but that would mean training to use it. How can you train with something that requires you to kill? How can he practice when every time he realized his Shikai, the only way to learn control was for something to die? He considered using animals, but there was so few livestock in Soul Society, so many people that didn't have enough food, it didn't feel right to him. It was these thoughts that plagued his mind since the moment he first learned Kurama's name, but after years of thinking, Naruto came to the conclusion that it was better he just didn't use her at all. If she didn't taste any blood, she couldn't hunt, and if she couldn't hunt, she couldn't kill. But now that wasn't an option anymore. Now that he had used his Shikai in front of people, he would be asked to use it again. If not by the captain commander, then Central 46, one way or another Naruto was sure they would want him to fight. Letting out a sigh, the blonde pulled himself out of the bath, grabbing a towel on his way to the door. There were fresh cloths waiting for him in the hall, though they weren't his, so after looking to make sure no one was watching, he took them and quickly changed. Now dressed in a plain gray short-sleeved shirt and pants, Naruto made his way to the room he would once again be sharing with his captain. It was late, and he had hoped she would have already gone to sleep, but the moment Naruto opened the door and saw Unohana on the bed waiting for him, that hope disappeared. The only light came from the full moon, which was shining into the room from the open window, making everything appear black and white. She was waiting for him, her eyes closed and the same smile she always wore on her face, hand placed calmly in her lap. Captain Unohana? When she didn't speak, Naruto stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, before slowly walking over to the blanket on the floor where he would be sleeping again. He kept his back to her as he tried to make it more comfortable, his movements still, as he waited for her to speak. I understand now, why you always refused to release your Shikai in our spars, and were so afraid to cut someone. She killed the bat hollow first, because even though it was while she was in her seal's form, its blood had touched her metal. You told me on more than one occasion that her power was to hunt, but until today I never understood what you meant, but now I do. Slowly turning, Naruto was met with the now open eyes of Hana, staring at him intently. Such a simple concept, yet so dangerous. Tell me, is it that you can't stop her once she has tasted blood, or that you have not trained with your Shikai enough? Eyes on the ground, Naruto slowly sat down on the blanket, his Zanpakuto on his lap. In theory, I should be able to learn how to stop a hunt, but Kurama would always be able to track them. But how can I train when every time I do something would need to die? I can't even use animals because there is never enough food to begin with, and if I start killing livestock it would only get worse. Ow. In a flash, Hana appeared in front of him and slapped the blonde in the back of the head, her smile still on her face as she now towered over him. If you had just told me sooner, I could have helped you, Naruto-san. In fact, I could have helped you gain control by now, but instead you gave up and tried to hide it. I don't understand. Gigai, Naruto-san, are manufactured human bodies. Empty shells, of course, but even when empty they function like a really body. They breathe, they digest food, and they have a heartbeat. Eyes widening at what he was being told, Naruto could only stare at his captain in shock, mouth wide open. Aye, the smile still on her face, Hana lay her hand on the top of his head, gently running her hand through his hair. The return trip went quicker, mostly because they didn't need to save their energy and were using Shunpo for most of it, but also because Naruto didn't have to listen to Akaku insulting him the whole way. Though the constant questions and requests for a fight were irritating, even after explaining that it would kill him, it only seemed to excite the bold Shinigami more. Typical 11th Division battle freak, not that Naruto could really talk. But at least now he had hope. With Hana's promise to help him train, Naruto might finally have a chance to make a real difference. At least he might, depending on how much trouble he was going to be in, now that his Shikai was revealed. Technically, no Shinigami could be punished for the nature of their Shikai, unless they shared it with another. It was out of their control, so you could not be blamed or banned from using it, no matter how dangerous it may be. However, hiding the fact he knew his Zanpakuto's name could be considered a punishable offense. Even if he never told anyone what it did, all Shinigami were required to inform someone, or it could be seen as trying to hide something from the Central 46. And if there was one thing everyone knew, even if they were too afraid to admit it out loud, it was that Central 46 was full of paranoid old men or women more concerned about holding on to their own power than the job they were originally created for. When they arrived at the meeting hall, Naruto was only slightly surprised to see that not only the captain commander, but also the captains of the 2nd and 12th divisions were waiting for them. He didn't like the looks both were sending him. Soi Fon was sending him a calculated look, her eyes switching from his face to the sword at his hip. Mayuri on the other hand, just had his eyes of Kurama, a hungry look in his eyes and a smirk on his face. They stopped in front of Yamamoto, Hana moving to stand in her place to the side as the captain of the 4th division, and before they could even bow the only commander spoke. Akaku Madarame and Yumachika Ayasagawa, your presence is not required for the remainder of this meeting, you are dismissed. Without a word both Shinigami left, though Naruto did catch the look they both sent him as they passed him, shunpoing away with the doors closing behind them. Getting on one knee, Naruto bowed his head to the captain commander, one hand on the hilt of his Zanpakuto. For a moment nothing was said, though he could feel all of their eyes on him, and he stayed with his head down waiting to be addressed. Naruto Uzumaki, I must admit I am impressed. How long have you been hiding? When did you first learn your Zanpakuto's name? My 2nd year at the academy, sir. That long, impressive, though I wonder if you would have been able to hide for as long as you have, without Captain Hana's help. Looking up at this point, though keeping head down, Naruto gulped at the fierce look in the old man's eyes as he stared down at him. Captain Hana has been good to me. Indeed she has, it is also because of her recommendation, and the fact you informed her about having attained Shikai, that you will not be punished for your actions. Eyes widening, Naruto's head shot up to look at the captain commander, unable to think of any words. Seeing his reaction, Yamamoto gave a small smile, his wrinkled and scared face crinkling. She requested I send a member of the 2nd division to observe your first mission, promising I would see something interesting, and from the report I have been given she was right. You have a lot of potential, Uzumaki-san, and from this point on we will be cultivating it. I don't understand. Captain Mayuri will be providing you with Gigai, For training until you are able to control your Zanpakuto, he has already ordered them moved to Captain Unohana's training ground. When you have gained enough control that you are no longer a risk to others in the field, Captain Soi Fon has shown an interest in assisting in your training, and possibly recruiting you to the 2nd Division. Until that time, however, you will remain in the 4th as Captain Unohana's vice-captain. Still unable to find any words, Naruto could do nothing but look at the people in the room, his mouth open and eyes wide in confusion. I still don't understand. You have skill, Uzumaki-san, along with the power to back it up, and a Zanpakuto that could become one of the most feared in the history of the Gode 13. A Zanpakuto that nothing can escape from, that can track the blood of any that touch its metal, is a useful skill to have at our disposal. I understand your wish to remain in the 4th Division, but you have more use to us in the field than on cleaning detail. Letting out a sigh, Naruto gave a small nod of his head, knowing that something like this would happen. I understand, sir. Good, then we have nothing more to discuss, you are dismissed. Without a word, Naruto stood, bowing to each captain, before shunpoing out of the room. I don't know why you will not just let me examine the Zanpakuto, it could hold interesting data for research purposes. If you just give me permission, I could take it from him. Frowning at the mad scientist, Unohana let her key show as she turned her smiling face at him, making the man cringe away from her slightly. You will do no such thing. If I find out you have made any move against him, I will personally make sure you regret it. The sound of the captain commander's cane hitting the floor stopped Mayuri from saying anything in his own defense. Make them both, along with Sui Fon, who had been stood quietly watching them, turned to face him. Enough, both of you, remember your ranks. They both gave small nods at his words, while continuing to glare at each other out of the corners of their eyes, as the old Shinigami stepped towards them. Nothing will be done to Naruto Uzumaki. He will be trained to control his Zanpakuto and to reach his full potential. And once he is ready, Uzumaki-san will make a good captain. This wasn't news to the people in the room, along with several others who weren't present, and Unohana could only smile at the thought filling her with pride. While it had been a betrayal of his trust, she had known from the start that Yamamoto needed to be made aware of Naruto's condition. His bloodlust could be both good and bad for Soul Society, just like her own had been, and just like Kenpachi's was now. So she told him, and together they had started to make plans. Naruto had all the makings of a good captain, and they were going to make sure he was ready, so that when the time came that a new captain was needed he would be able to step into the position. Stepping forward, Sui Fon crossed her arms over her chest, a frown on her face. Are you sure about this, Captain Yamamoto? His is still only 10 years out of the academy. Normally it takes hundreds before even making vice captain. Giving a slow nod of his head, Yamamoto let out a deep sigh, turning to face the serious 2nd Division captain. I know this is happening fast, but I truly believe we will see great thing from him. Even before learning the true nature of his Zanpakuto, Uzumaki-san showed potential, but now I think I was not giving him enough credit. Uzumaki-san is a hunter, one that we will train and mold, before pointing him towards his prey. He will be ready for whatever lays ahead of him, and will become a true protector of Soul Society, one that we will all be proud to call a comrade. Without another word, the only man walked out the room, Unohana watching his retreating form for a moment before leaving herself. Naruto stood in the middle of Unohana's training ground, his Shikai active, and a look of concentration on his face. He was surrounded by 7 Gigai, each with a simple mod soul controlling it that was designed to eject on death so they could be reused, and that couldn't feel pain. They all looked exactly the same, generic features without hair, and the only thing that made them stand out was the numbers painted on their shoulders from 1 to 7. They all wore simple black pants, white sleeveless shirts, and carried a katana. Turning to look at his captain out of the corner of his eye, Naruto saw Unohana watching him from the side, smile in place. Kill 4, 6 and 7, disable 1, 5 and 3, and leave 2 unharmed. Giving a small nod, Naruto waited for the Gigai to make the first move, crossing his needle-covered arms in front of his chest as they lifted their katana. The first to move was 7, sword raised over his head as he charged forward, trying to bring it down on the blonde's skull. His Shikai ratting, Naruto blocked the strike with his tail, before backhanding his attacker across the chest, scratching it in the process as he flew away. Next came 3 and 6 working together and coming at him from both sides, 3 on the right aiming high and 6 on the left aiming low. In response, Naruto jumped into the air, tucking his legs into his chest as the needles covered his body completely, turning him into a spiky red ball. He started to spin on the spot, and the moment the two katana hit, they were both reached from their users' hands, clattering to the floor on the other side of the room. Before either had time to back away, Naruto unfolded himself while he was still spinning, catching 6 in the stomach with his claws and 3 in the leg with the end of his tail before kicking both away. Without turning to look, Naruto's tail batted away the strike from one, before he pivoted on the spot and backhanded him away. It was at that point that 2, 4 and 5 came at him from 3 different directions. Flicking his wrists towards 4 and 5, Naruto sent out a single needle at each of them, both of which hit them in the hands and forced them to drop their katana. Even though they couldn't feel pain, they were programmed to react like a real person. Then, sidestepping 2, Naruto clenched his needle-covered fist and punched him in the back as he passed, throwing him off balance and making him stumble. Jumping away, Naruto watched as all the Gigai got back to their feet, moving to regroup. The whole thing had only lasted about 20 seconds. He watched as the tattoo appeared on each of their chests over where their hearts were, a simple red circle with a black spiral inside. Now that he was actually able to train with his Zanpakuto, Naruto had noticed that the tattoo appeared on anyone Kurama tasted, marking them. It would fade away when he sealed her again, only to reappear when she was realized, acting as a reminder that their lives were in his hands. They had tested Kurama's tracking ability over the last few years, and found that no matter how far away a mark was, she would always be able to find it, even if they were in the living world. How she was able to cross over to the other world, no one knew, not even Naruto. It also helped that he was able to control his bloodlust, at least to a certain extent, and didn't go crazy at the sight of blood anymore. If a fight was good enough, and really got his blood pumping, he would lose himself, but other than that he was able to contain his excitement. Closing his eyes for a moment, Naruto pictured what he wanted to happen, before letting the needles burst outward and swarm above his head. Like every time he used his Shikai, the only sound they made was the rattling as they knocked against each other, forming the grinning fox head as it pointed to his first target. Moving around the others without touching them, the needles swarmed to 7 and crashed into him with enough force to knock him off his feet, before tearing him to shreds. By the time he hit the ground, all that was left was a bloody mess, which was unrecognizable as ever being human in shape. They then moved on to 6, forming a stream and spinning to form a drill-like spike, before piecing him through the back, coming out his chest through the tattoo. It was at this moment the 1 and 3 attacked him directly again, both having retrieved their katana, trying to take advantage of the fact his needles weren't there to protect him. The moment they were within his reach, Naruto stepped forward and grabbed them both by the throats with his still-clawed hands, lifting them a foot off the ground each. Before either he or they had time to do anything else, the needles surrounded 3 and started spinning around his body, acting as a blander and shredding his skin, but not causing enough damage to kill him before doing the same to 1. Letting them both fall to the ground with a groan, Naruto watched as the swarm moved to engulf 4, who was stood near a wall, hitting him with so much force he could hear them impacting with the wall behind him. Ducking the swing that came from behind him as 5 tried to take off his head, Naruto jumped into the air and flipped just as the needles passed him, moving around his body like water before attacking both the Gigai's arms and legs, Naruto landing in a crouch on the floor in front of him. Slowly standing back up, the blonde Shinigami turned to watch as 2 was surrounded by the needles, all of them pointing in his direction and floating in the air about a foot away from touching his skin. There was nowhere for the Gigai to move without a needle stabbing him, and every time he did they would vibrate in warning, causing the ones close together to rattle. The sound of clapping reached his ears, signaling the end of the fight, and as he turned to face his captain, the needles moved back to him, turning to their sealed state in front of him so he could grab the Zanpakuto before it hit the ground. He was panting slightly. The effort it took to stop Kurama killing during her hunts was more than it was to just use her, but by the time Unohana had moved to stand in front of him, he was breathing normally again. He watched as his captain took her time examining the Gigai, her smile fading slightly as she examined the disabled ones he had been told not to kill, before turning to look at him with a sigh. It seems we have reached your limit on non-lethal attacks. Your Shikai is simple, too violent and bloodthirsty not to cause server damage, but at least they are still alive. Nodding in agreement, Naruto started moving to collect the little green balls that held the mod souls on the ground, all of them having been ejected once the fight was over. I'm sorry Captain Hana, but once she feels the blood on her metal, Kurama gets too excited, and can't help herself. She still complains every time I stop her from killing her targets, says it's against her nature to leave survivors. So when I stop her, the least she can do is cripple them for a while, if not permanently. Handing over the 7 mod soul pills, Naruto moved to retrieve his sheath, which he had once again thrown away when he drew his Zanpakuto. It was a bad habit to have gotten into, but he had seen worse, and he was always able to find it later. His training with Hana over the last 3 years had been working wonderfully, and while hard, Naruto was able to cancel a hunt and even attack without killing. Damaged and sometimes in critical condition, maybe, but alive all the same. Nodding in agreement, Hana put the mod soul pills in her pocket, before slowly making her way to the door. Indeed, Kurama is a raver violent Zanpakuto, but for now I think this is the best we can do. Be sure to clean up before you leave, and remember the vice captain meeting tonight. I'm sure you wouldn't want to be late. Also, starting tomorrow you will report to Captain Soi Fon at the 2nd Division Barracks at 6 a.m. for your first training session. Of course, Captain Hana. After he had finished cleaning the raining ground, Naruto moved on to the rest of his duties for the day, having only been in the training room for the last hour and still have most of it left. As vice captain, it was his job to oversee the 4th Division's training, organize and hand out assignments and basically deal with anything that might come up so that Hana didn't have to. Having said that, Naruto was hopeless at anything to do with healing, and could do nothing to help in the hospital. Luckily about a year ago, after avoiding him since he replaced her as vice captain, Naruto had been able to talk to Izan. It wasn't easy, and the slap she had gave him hurt like hell, but after a week straight of wearing her down, the blonde had been able to work things out with the silver-hair Shinigami. They had talked, Naruto letting the woman vent at him for hours until she had finally gotten everything out, and after that Naruto knew what he needed to do. After talking to Hana, he was able to convince her that he wasn't skilled enough in the medical field to be responsible for the 4th Division's hospital, but Izan was. Ever since that day, he had been the joint vice captain, with Izan handling the medical side while he took control of the combat training. After that, his relationship with his fellow vice captain had slowly improved, even more so when Izan finally admitted to herself that she just wasn't much of a fight. They would still spar from time to time. Now that he didn't have to worry about killing a comrade the moment he released his Shikai, Naruto wasn't afraid to anymore, and every time he would win. But unlike their first spar, Izan seemed to be able to accept it, and would even listen to him when he gave her advice. It made life easier for both of them, and now that the 4th Division wasn't divided between the two, everything moved a lot more smoothly. Now, none of the people in the 4th Division would ever be suited as frontline fighters, but with Naruto taking charge of their training they were no longer considered weak cowards by anyone other than the 11th Division, and even they had more sense than to cause trouble with him around. Naruto had become one of the few people in the 4th Division that they respected, and while they were a little rough around the edges, he could honestly say a few were his friends. Making his way to the outside training field, where 20 of his division members were already waiting for him, Naruto stood at the front of the group and started calling out orders. Hana watched from her office window as Naruto led the group through different stances, having them copy him one after another, and could only smile. A few years ago, even this much would have had the members panting and sweating, but now they could train for hours at a time and still have the energy to work. It just went to show how much they all respected Naruto that they were willing to train so hard under him, and only those willing did. Naruto had made it clear that anyone that didn't want to follow his training didn't have to, but once they started he would personally make sure they stuck with it. It was only a small number that took his offer, but he had yet to have a single person fail him. Naruto seemed to just have this aura around him, and once you got past the fear seeing him fight would cause, it was like no one wanted to disappoint him. It was just one more reason why she knew he would make a good captain one day. Even the way he had handled his issues with Izan, not only admitting that he didn't know the first thing about healing, but also getting her to finally admit she wasn't a fighter. It took a lot for most people to be able to admit their own faults, but if anything Naruto was the opposite and couldn't admit his positives. He was always too hard on himself, too quick to take the blame even if it wasn't his fault, and it always made her frown when she saw him fall into one of his depressions. She knew he still struggled with himself, and that he was always worried about losing control, But after much effort on her part she had been able to get him to the point he would willing spar with others. The fact that every time anyone he sparred with would invertible get cut, and be remained he could kill them without even being around when the mark appeared on their chests when he realized his Shikai, could still cause problems but they were easy to deal with. To date, she was the only person that had sparred with him that had never been cut, and therefore was never marked. Kenpachi, after hearing about Naruto from Akaku, had shown up at the barracks looking for him the same day they returned from the mission 3 years ago, looking for a fight. Luckily, she had been able to convince him to wait until his training was finished, so that it would be a better fight. Now every time she saw Naruto, the battle-crazy captain would grin like the Cheshire Cat, as if he could already see the fight in his mind. Hana had little doubt that Naruto would be able to kill Kenpachi, for one simple reason: the man was too eager for a fight. When it came down to it, the man was nothing but a powerhouse with nothing but his immense spiritual pressure. He didn't even know the name of his Zanpakuto and had no desire to try and learn it. When they fought, and there was no doubt that they one day would, Hana knew that he would let Naruto cut him just to have a chance to fight him at full strength. But once Kurama tasted blood, she didn't stop hunting unless Naruto made her. You could run, evade and block as much as you wanted, but no matter what you did the needles would never stop attacking. Even a juggernaut like Kenpachi gets tired eventually. Kurama didn't, and they had tested this fact on several occasions. But Hana also knew that Naruto wouldn't kill him, almost yes, but he would never kill another Shinigami. And now he was able to control his Shikai. The next part of his training would begin, and while he would still be part of the 4th Division, Soi Fon would be taking over for the most part. Now that he had control, Naruto needed to refine his skill, and the best to teach him that was the captain of the 2nd Division. Honestly, Hana wouldn't be surprised if her fellow captain tried to take him as her own vice-captain, knowing her thoughts on the one she had currently. Naruto would be perfect for the 2nd Division, defiantly better than Omeda, and would fit right in. Hana honestly thought of Naruto was a little brother, or even son at this point, having trained him for the last 13 years or so. He was so much like her, both now and back before she joined the 4th Division, and she was proud of the man he was becoming, even if he didn't look a day over 17. He had brought respect back to her division both from the others and for themselves, and had inspired many to train to better themselves instead of just accepting being weak. No, she would not give him up without a fight, unless he wanted to join a different division. He had done too much good for the 4th to just give up, but at the same time deserved to be happy. Things were going to be getting complicated. Naruto made his way through the 10th Division barracks with practiced ease, having been coming to the vice-captain meeting every week for the last 13 years, except for the few times he was on a mission. He knew the corridors almost as well as his own barracks, and because they always met in the same room, knew exactly where he needed to go. He paused outside the door, hearing the voices on the other side, before taking a deep breath and sliding it open. Naruto-kun. Before he had time to process what was happening, Naruto's vision was blocked, and his mouth covered as something wrapped around the back of his head and held his face in place. He struggled for a moment, his unseen face turning purple from lack of oxygen, his arms flailing around wildly. Let the poor guy of Rangaku before you smother him in your tits. If you kill him, Captain Hana will probably come looking for you. He sent a grateful look over to Shuhei, the vice-captain of the 9th Division, who lifted his drink up in acknowledgement of the gesture. Unfortunately, before Naruto could actually say anything, he was turned around in Rangaku's arms, the back of his head now pressed into her chest as she pulled him closer. Shut up, Shuhei. What I do with Naruto-kun is none of your business, you're just jealous. Her grip tightened again, and Naruto found his airway cut off, again. Seeing his dilemma, Kira, the 3rd Division vice-captain, let out a nervous chuckle before pointing at the blonde's face as it changed colors. You're chalking him again, Rangaku? Getting a confused expression, the orange-haired Shinigami followed the man's finger, her eyes falling on the struggling vice-captain she was hugging. Blinking in surprise, as if only just realizing that he was trying to break her grip, Rangaku let out a giggle before finally letting him go. The moment he was free, Naruto fell to his knees and tried to take in as much air as possible, ignoring the amused expressions of the people around him. This seemed to happen every time he ran into a drunk Rangaku, and no matter how strong he was, Naruto was powerless to stop her. Ha ha ha, one of these days you're going to actually suffocate him doing that, Rangaku. Yeah, but what a way to go, am I right? Turning to glare at both Omeda and Kyan, the second and 13th vice captains, Naruto slowly pulled himself to his feet with a defeated sigh. Despite the way they teased him, Naruto couldn't help but smile at the people in the room, all of who he could now call his friends. It had been a little rough at the start, most of them blaming him for Izan losing her possession, but everything had worked out fine in the end. Before he could think much about the past though, Naruto felt something hitting him in the back, almost knocking him back on the floor. Hi Whisker-kun. Turning his head to the left slightly, the blonde found himself looking into the familiar grinning face of Yachiru Kusajishi, the 11th Division vice captain. The small pink-haired girl had latched herself onto his back and was looking over his shoulder, her large brown eyes full of innocence that was ruined at her next words. Kenny wanted me to tell you he is looking forward to your fight, and that you should train really hard so he can have fun killing you. The others in the room could only sweat drop the scene. Having gotten used to it after the truth about the blonde was found out 3 years ago, she had been passing messages like that at every meeting. Shaking his head as the small girl jumped off his back, Naruto was about to find a seat, only to be stopped when his hand was grabbed and Rainaku pulled him over to the drink table. Come on Naru-kun, come and have a drink with me, it's now fun drinking along. But what about everyone else? But Naru-kun, I want to drink with you. Now sit down and drink the damn sake, before I force it down your throat. Eyes widening, Naruto grabbed the dish he was offered and took a large gulp, not want to risk being suffocated again. It was a long-running joke to all that knew him that Naruto couldn't say no to a woman, especially strong-willed women, which unfortunately covered most of the women he knew. The fact he was already considered one of the most dangerous Shinigami in Soul Society at the moment only seemed to make it funnier. The only time he could stand up for himself was while in a fight, but that normally led to someone being sent into intensive care, so it wasn't seen often. But while embarrassing for Naruto, it was great entertainment for everyone else, and Rainaku liked to take full advantage of it. Uzumaki-san, you shouldn't let Rainaku-san push you around like that, have some self-respect. Everyone sent a dull expression at Nanao eyes, the vice captain of the 8th Division, at how she seemed unable to hear the hypocrisy of her own words. Oh chill out Nanao-chan, learn to have some fun, you're going to get wrinkles if you keep frowning all the time. Suddenly feeling very small sat between the two arguing women, Naruto quickly drank the rest of his sake before carefully backing away as they started to argue, both too busy with each other to notice. Finally free of Rainaku, Naruto moved to stand with Kyan, sending a nod to Izan and Nemu as he passed them. Seeing his friend, the black-haired vice captain smiled, handing him another drink. I still can't believe the great and powerful Naruto Uzumaki doesn't know how to deal with strong women. I mean come on, just grow a pair. Frowning, a thought suddenly came to the blonde's mind that made him smirk, which Kyan didn't seem to notice as he took a large gulp from his cup. You're right, I should learn to stand up to women, and speaking of, how's Miyako-chan? Chalking on his drink, Kyan spat out what was in his mouth, hitting a now glaring Sasaki Chojiro, the vice captain of the 1st Division, and spent the next 2 minutes coughing. When he recovered, Kyan sent an apologetic smile at the old Shinigami, before clearing his throat and putting his now empty cup down. She's good, really good, so anyway how has your training been going? Naruto knew exactly what his friend was trying to do, but decided to take pity on him and let the conversation move on, instead of teasing him about how whipped his wife had him. After arriving at the 2nd Division barracks 30 minutes early, Naruto was directed to and told to wait in Captain Soi Fon's office until she arrived. It was very Spartan compared to Hana's office, which was full of bookcases on medical treatments and pictures of 4th Division members both alive and dead. This office was clearly all about formality, with almost no personal touches at all. It didn't even have a window. In fact, the only personal touch seemed to be a picture set on the desk. Walking around to get a better look at it, Naruto saw that it was of 3 people stood side by side, 2 grinning and the other with a small frown and blush on her face. The one blushing was, much too whiskered blonde's shock, a younger Captain Soi Fon. She was stood between other Shinigami, a man and a woman, both of whom had their arms around her shoulders. The man had messy, light blonde hair and gray eyes, with a lazy smile on his lips. The other woman was grinning widely into the camera, and had long purple hair tied back into a ponytail, and bright gold eyes. The only one he recognized was Sui Fon, though from the few times he had seen her it was hard to so, and couldn't remember seeing either of the other two around Seireiti. Not to say he remembered everyone he met, in fact if anything he was terrible at remembering people he didn't see on a regular basis, but still he would remember people this close to a captain. But before Naruto could take any time to think about it, he was able to just pick up the sound of footsteps coming his way, and quickly moved away from the desk so as not to get in trouble for snooping. Not a moment later, the door opened and a sour-faced Sui Fon walked in, and Naruto was able to hear her muttering about a useless, fat ass, before her eyes landed on him. "You're on time, that's good. If you're ever late and don't have a very good reason I will hand you by your feet in the 11th Division training field, understood?" Eye widening, Naruto quickly nodded his head, taking a step back from the clearly irritated captain. "Yes, Captain Soi Fon, I understand." Nodding, the short Shinigami turned her back to him without a word, motioning for him to follow her. He was getting several odd looks from people in black masks as they passed them. Most of the members of the 2nd Division wore masks, though Naruto never knew why. The training ground she led him to was similar to the one Hana had spared with him in for the last 13, in that it was inside a room the same size, but that was where the similarity ended. With the exception of a 5-foot ring around the edge of the room, it was made up of bamboo poles ranging from 10 to 15 feet tall, each spaced 3 feet apart. Without a word Sui Fon closed the door behind her, and jumped up to stand on one of the poles, before turning to frown at him when he didn't instantly follow. "Well, I don't have all day, get up here and draw your Zanpakuto." Quickly doing as he was told, Naruto jumped up, wobbling slightly before he gained his balance. Seeing that the small captain had already drew her sword, he took his own off his hip, the sheath flying to the side with a flick of his wrist, and he almost lost his balance again trying to get into his stance. Frown still in place, Naruto was starting to wonder if she ever stopped. Sui Fon got into her own stance. "This will be an all-out spar, starting with simple swordsmanship, while trying to keep your balance. If you fall it will count as a fail, and we will start again." Nodding, Naruto barely had enough time to raise his Zanpakuto in time to block the strike aimed at his chest, the captain having shunpoed to the pole in front of him faster than Naruto thought possible, the force from which almost made him fall. Sui Fon didn't like the blonde in front of her for several reasons. The first was that she just didn't like blondes on principle, plain as that, and even though it wasn't the same shade it still reminded her of a certain blonde that would drive her insane. The second was because for 10 years, despite being told about him after the first 5 of his training, she had never been able to see anything special about him. He had hidden himself from not just her, but the entire 2nd Division, and that was a serious blow to her pride, one that couldn't be fixed. The third was the fact he was, to her mind, a coward for hiding himself in the 4th Division in the first place. Instead of joining a division where he could be trained for combat, he had tried to hide, and if not for Hana noticing him so soon his potential would have been wasted. The fourth, and reason she admitted to herself was more petty than the others, was simple: the fact he wasn't in her division. If he had been placed under her care from the start, she would have been able to get rid of the large walking pile of useless fat she was forced to call a vice captain. His Zanpakuto was a hunt and kill for Kami's sake, and he was able to, with the assistance of special cloth, suppress his immense spiritual pressure to zero. Everything about him, to her mind at least, screamed Onmitsukido. But instead of being under her care, he was placed in the division that had no real use for him. Now, Sui Fon wasn't stupid enough to think healers weren't a necessity, or that the fact the 4th Division basically kept the Seireiti running with cleaning and maintenance wasn't important. She could even admit that since Naruto was put in charge of their training, that there had been a marked improvement in the quality of fighters in the division. But the fact remained that there was no logical reason for him not to have been moved when his true skills became known. Yet he was still being wasted there, even if he was training with one of the strongest captains in the Gode 13. Sui Fon knew he would be put to better use in her own. That was why, despite her dislike of the blonde, had agreed to help in his training when the time came. Because this was her chance to try and convert him over to her division, where he rightfully belonged, and so she would finally be rid of Omeda. Naruto was barely able to stop himself from falling, and quickly moved his left foot to another pole to help steady himself, Sui Fon having already backed away from him. He had heard stories about how fast the captain of the second division was, but this was his first time seeing it in person, and Naruto realized that they really didn't do her justice. Naruto had always had a fast shunpo, one that had only improved since he started training with Captain Unohana, but the short captain in front of him was in a league of her own. Deciding he would need to find better foot, the blonde jumped to another pole, keeping his eyes fixed on his opponent. But the moment his foot left the pole he had been stood on, Naruto gasped as a small, but powerful foot shot into his stomach. Coughing as he was sent flying back several feet, Naruto was just able to grab a pole with his free hand, his feet on two separate poles and stopping him from hitting the floor. Unfortunately, before he was able to pull himself back up, Naruto was once again kicked in the stomach, the force of which made him lose his grip and fall to the group with a loud thump. Groaning in slight pain, he used a pole next to him to help pull himself up, Kurama somehow still in his hand. First rule of fighting: never give your opponent time to recover, take every advantage you can get. There is no such thing as honor, it is an illusion and lie created by weaker-minded people who wanted others to think the same as them. In a fight you do whatever it takes to win. Now get back up here, we go again, and this time don't just let me hit you. Naruto fought to keep his rising bloodlust down, both her words and the fight making it stir inside him, his blood pumping slightly faster at the thought of fighting her again. A few years ago, this would have been enough to make him lose control, but not anymore. Quickly doing as he was told, Naruto jumped back up, making sure he had better footing this time. But again, just like the last time, Soi Fon appeared right in front of him. This time however, instead of aiming a swing at his chest, she came in low and kicked his legs out from under him. Flipping in the air, Naruto used his free hand to push off of a pole and throw himself away, slashing at the captain with his sword as he passed and making her retreat. Instead of landing on two poles, Naruto instead balanced himself on one with a single foot, wobbling slightly as he tried to keep his balance. He watched as Soi Fon did the same thing he did, only with a lot more grace, before once again disappearing. Reacting quickly, Naruto turned to his left just in time to see her reappear with her blade poised to strike, and instead of trying to block her with his Zanpakuto, used a skill Unohana had taught him. Lifting his hand, the blonde Shinigami struck the side of the blade, letting it run down the metal slightly before pushing it away just before it hit his side. It worked perfectly, diverting the Zanpakuto and momentarily throwing Soi Fon off balance, but not enough to make her fall. Using the moment to his advantage, Naruto pivoted on his pole, spinning around to build up momentum to slam the butt of his sword into the back of her neck. Or he would have, if the short captain hadn't already shunpoed away from him, appearing about 20 feet away on a different pole. Better, but still not good enough. Your reaction time is slow, and your balance is sloppy at best. I was expecting better from Captain Unohana's prize student. And with those words, Naruto lost the fight against his bloodlust, his eyes widening and a large grin appearing on his face. You want better? I'll give you better. The pole under his foot exploded as Naruto jumped off of it, splintering into 1,000 pieces as he launched himself at the still frowning captain. Just as he was about to slam into her, Soi Fon bent backwards at the waist at an impossible angle, and kicked up as he passed over her head. Naruto was thrown up, but didn't even grunt at the pain, and as he came back down started to spin in the air. Unable to time where his Zanpakuto was because of the spinning, Soi Fon was forced to shunpo out of the way of the falling blonde, just as he landed on the pole she had been standing on. This time, instead of letting the captain close the distance, Naruto moved in, splintering the pole he was stood on yet again. By this point his body was starting to be covered by a red shroud, his spiritual pressure reacting to his bloodlust, and was trailing behind him slightly as he charged. Aiming a strike at Soi Fon's shoulder, which was easily blocked, Naruto used his free hand to grab her by the wrist before she could shunpo away again. Grunting, Naruto swung the smaller captain, and threw her to the side. Moving quickly while she was still in the air, he then flipped his Zanpakuto so he was holding it like a spear, and threw it at her airborne body. Only for her to flip in the air, avoiding the flying Zanpakuto, before kicking it as it passed under her. Shunpoing forward, Naruto caught the blade before it hit the ground, then shunpoing back again to avoid the double kick aimed at his back. Both coming to a stop on opposite sides of the room, Naruto suddenly seeming to have no trouble finding his balance on the poles now. They both raised their Zanpakuto at the same time as Naruto ran his hand along the blade. Hunt, Kurama, sting all enemies to death, Suzumaki. The moment she saw the look in his eyes, Soi Fon knew it wasn't a spar anymore, having been warned by Unohana that this could happen. But honestly, she had not believed the blonde in front of her could really have a bloodlust to match Kenpachi, at least not completely without seeing it with her own eyes. And that was exactly what she was seeing right now. She also noticed the fact that he wasn't having problems balancing on the poles anymore, and his shunpo speed had increased slightly, though still not to her own level. This was what she had wanted to see, his true potential, the thing that made him such a feared fighter. It was one thing to read a report, but another to see it with her own eyes, and Sui Feng always trusted her own eyes over others. Other people missed important details, or simple didn't think them so and forgot about them, but she had spent years perfecting her observation abilities. When she saw him about release his Shikai, she quickly made to follow his action, knowing that even though she was a captain she wasn't all-powerful. Having spent hours reading reports about the blonde, she knew that it would only take a single drop of blood, and after that nothing mattered. One drop of blood in Naruto could kill anyone, no matter how much stronger or faster they were than him, a skill she would admit to being a little jealous of. It took her Shikai 2 strikes to kill, and until he came along that had seemed to her a powerful ability suitable to a member of the 2nd Division. But after hearing about the hunt, she had started to doubt the efficiency of her Shikai, and that only made her angrier. While her Bankai was a one-hit kill, it was much too flashy for her to ever willingly use if she could avoid it, and even then the thought made her frown. Watching as the red aura around him disappeared, one that had made her think of a fox based on the shape it had taken for some reason, Sui Feng's eyes took in the form of the blonde's Shikai. From the hundreds of thousands of red needles that made up the armor on his arms, to the scythe-like claws on the ends of his fingers and the long tail swishing behind him. The sight of it made her smirk slightly, and just made her all the more determined to have him in her division. It was this ability, the power of his Shikai, which Sui Feng wanted in her division. The power of the hunt, as the reports claim he called it, the power to never lose your mark once you got a single drop of blood to touch the metal. After all, along with everything else they did, the 2nd Division was in charge of keeping the others in line, reporting directly to the Central 46. With someone like Naruto working with them, their job would be all the easier. With a deep, animalistic growl, the blonde Shinigami charged towards her. His bloodlust had taken a noticeable drop after releasing his Shikai, but had also started acting wilder, his mind seeming to become closer to the animal his Shikai was based on. He was still in control, but Sui Feng noticed his eyes change slightly, from a berserker to a hunter. Despite herself, the look in his eyes sent a pleasant tingle down her spine, her stomach flipping slightly as they landed on her. But she was able to brush it off easily, bringing her own Shikai in front of her face, preparing for the fight to continue. Normally, Sui Feng would be the first to attack, using her speed to close the distance and control the flow of the fight. But not this time. She knew that with the needles currently covering his body like armor, she would be putting herself at risk of being cut. The only way he would lose that defense was if her cut her, though, whether that was because he couldn't without the blood or not, was unknown. But from what she had read in the reports, his Shikai, when the needles were released, would touch nothing but their target. It was this fact that led Sui Feng to believe the needles were only able to attack something when they tasted its blood, a key weakness that she was going to use to her advantage, because it was the only one she was able to find. Every Zanpakuto had a weakness, no matter how strong, you just had to find it. For 2 minutes the two Shinigami stared each other down without a word, Sui Feng with a frown on her face, and Naruto with a snarl. Neither had so much as twitched the whole time, the only movement being the rise and fall of their chests as they breathed, not even daring to blink. But then it happened, the slight tensing of the blonde's legs, an action the small captain had been waiting for. The moment he disappeared in a shunpo, Sui Feng flipped backwards, knowing she would not be able to block him with her small Shikai, and kicked out as she did. The move worked, and the moment Naruto appeared in front of where she had been stood, he was met with a kick to his chin, knocking him back. Landing on her free hand, Sui Feng used his moment of confusion to close the space between them, tapping her bladed finger against his chest. Only to be forced back herself when his tail came from between his legs and tried to bat her away. A moment later her black butterfly mark appearing, even over his clothes. She also knew from reports that even brushing against the needles was enough to leave a scratch, and that was all he needed. In a one-on-one fight, Naruto would always have the advantage, because the only way to get past his defense was for the hunt to be activated, and the only way that would happen was if he had your blood. But once he had your blood it was the end, because there was one way to stop it, not even killing him. Using her small body, along with years of training, Soi Fon was able to bend and twist out of the way of the tail before jumping away without being touched. The needles rattled loudly, as if angry that she had avoided being hit, before settling back down. But Naruto seemed to have taken her earlier words to heart, and instead of giving her time to regain her bearings, closed the space between them and slipped at her with his clawed hand. Once again bending away from the strike, Soi Fon once again put space between them by shunpoing away, the attack missing her chin by an inch. It was at this point that Naruto finally seemed to notice her mark on his chest, the frown that crossed his lips making a smirk appear on her own, as the blonde scratched at the butterfly. Unfortunately the smirk was quickly wiped away when, with a loud rattle, needles started to move across his body from over his shoulder, covering his chest and the mark. She also noticed that his tail seemed to have shortened by a foot, and the rattling had gotten even louder now that they moved with his breathing. Frowning, having not known he was able to move the needles at will on his body, Soi Fon lowered her stance a little move in preparation for her next attack. However, before she could move, Naruto shunpoed out of her line of sight. Quickly turning on the spot, the short captain could only growl in frustration when she couldn't find him, her eyes darting from place to place quickly. The only thing that saved her was the rattling that came from under her feet. And without taking the time to look, she shunpoed away just in time to avoid the tail that shot up from between the poles. Her eyes widening slightly, Soi Fon turned her attention down, and saw Naruto swinging between the poles with ease. He was using hands, feet and even his tail to dart in and out of her sight between the poles, moving faster than he had while trying to run on top of them. Her frown quickly returning, she once again jumped to the side to avoid the tail as it came at her, only to shunpo mid-jump when several needles shot out in every direction. Reappearing, Soi Fon watched as the needles moved to about 10 foot away from the tail, before stopping in mid-air for a second, then shooting back to their previous place. The sight brought a small smirk to her face. So without blood 10 foot was the limit, and from the way the needles were shot in every direction, he had little to no control of the direction they move. In fact, all the needs had moved in a straight line out from the tail, before moving back in the same way. With this new bit of information, Soi Fon quickly thought up a plan, her eyes narrowing as Naruto jumped back up to stand on the poles. Jumping forward instead of using a shunpo, the short captain stopped herself 9 feet away from the blonde. He tried to close the space between them, but every time he did she would jump back, keep it the same. This continued for several minutes, Soi Fon playing cat and mouse with the blonde, though the fact she was normally the cat was making it a little hard. She could see the frustration on his face every time she backed away or avoided the needles he sent at her, and when it got to the point he was actually growling, sent him a confident and mocking smirk. It had the effect she wanted, and with a grunt, Naruto crossed his arms in front of his body before throwing them out. This had the effect of making every needle shooting out of his body at the same time in every direction, leaving his body, and most importantly her mark unprotected. Jumping forward, Soi Fon twisted her body while in the air through a small gap in the charging needles, landing on her free hand. Quickly pushing off, she then flipped into the air, landing on a pole right in front of the blonde, and thrust her bladed finger towards his chest, only to stop an inch from touching her mark. Dead, I win. They spared several more times, though Naruto wasn't sure how long they had been in the training ground, each time the small captain winning. After cleaning up the poles he had broken, Naruto was led back to the captain's office, where he was told to sit and keep quiet. While finding this odd, the blonde really didn't want to risk the woman's wrath, so decided to just do as he was told. He watched as Soi Fon started to fill out a report, though he didn't know what it was about, and worked through her paperwork for about 30 minutes without making a sound. Not even when she had someone come in and take the paperwork she had just completed, with the order to take it to the captain commander, before the masked Shinigami shunpoed out of the room with a nod. When that was finally done, she leaned back in her chair with her arms crossed, and her usual frown on her lips. She seemed to take a moment to observe him, her eyes boring into his face, before finally speaking. "You will be here every day at 6 a.m., from now until I say otherwise, for training. Once we have finished working on your base skills, Captain Commander Yamamoto has instructed me to begin training you to achieve Bankai, which will take even more time. But for now, I have arranged for a room to be prepared for you in this barracks." Getting a confused expression on his face at the last part of her sentence, though the whole Bankai training thing was news to him too, Naruto sat up a little straighter in his seat. "But Captain Hana told me I would remain a member of the 4th Division, why would I need a room here?" His answer was another frown, before Soi Fon gestured for him to look at the clock on the wall, making his eyes widen when he saw it was 2 a.m. They had been training the whole day, and most of the night it seemed, without him even noticing. "It is 3 hours past curfew, I cannot allow you to leave the barracks, and so you will need to stay the night. Tomorrow we will continue your training. I have already ordered several of my subordinates to change the training room by morning, so it will be a different obstacle. But, what about my vice-captain responsibilities? Izan-san will be able to pick up the slack while you are training, and we will put aside a day for things other than training. We both will still have to attend meetings after all. The room is 5 doors down the hall on your right." Without another word, Sui Feng turned her attention back to the papers on her desk, silently telling him to leave. Unable to think of anything to say, Naruto got to his feet and left without a word, closing the door behind him. "I will not sit by as you try and steal my vice-captain anymore, Captain Soi Fon. This stops now. I am merely doing as I was ordered to by the Captain Commander, training him because you couldn't. I have done nothing wrong." Standing with her arms crossed under her chest, her usual smile missing from her face, Hana glared at the smaller captain. It had been a month since Naruto had started training under Sui Fon, and so far the short captain had been keeping him very busy, so busy in fact he had almost no time for his vice-captain duties. It was for this reason that Hana had come storming over to the 2nd Division barracks, her spiritual pressure bringing anyone that crossed her path to their knees, before breaking the door to the office down. She had known exactly what the woman had been trying to do, and wasn't going to just stand by and let it continue, not without a fight. Naruto was her vice-captain. Now here they were, in Sui Feng's office. The woman of her ire sat behind her desk and returning the glare. "Don't try and play dumb with me. You've had your eye on Naruto-san since you first learned of him. I was at the meeting when you requested him to be transferred to your division." Shooting up from her seat, the smaller captain slammed both her hands down onto the table between them. Sui Feng's face started to turn red. "He shouldn't even be in the 4th Division in the first place. You know that, everyone knows that, so you admit it, you're trying to take him from my division. Yes, he is being wasted in your division training others when he could be in the field. It was his choice to join the 4th Division, not mine, and it is a choice I choose to respect. This is a military operation, we do not have the option of respecting his choices when we are at constant war with the Hollow. He is a fighter, not a medic, and not a teacher. That is enough, from both of you." Both their eyes widening at the unexpected voice, Hana turned to see Captain Yamamoto stood in the doorway, leaning on his walking stick as he glared them both down. Quickly bending at the waist, knowing that Sui Feng would be doing the same, Hana stepped to the side as the elderly captain commander moved to stand in front of the desk. "I had a feeling something like this would happen, though I had hope I was wrong, but now it has come to this." Shaking his head, Yamamoto looked from Hana to Sui Feng, before turning his back on them both. "I am calling a meeting, come to the captain's hall and bring your vice-captains. Hell butterflies will be sent to the other captains with the same message." "Excuse me?" Captain Hana had come to get both him and Izan, telling them that a meeting had been called, but not what it was about. He had been surprised when they were led to the captain's hall, because unless they were in a state of lockdown, it was rare for the vice-captains to be present for a captain's meeting. When he saw that all the other captains and vice-captains were also already there, and all of them were looking at him, Naruto had a bad feeling. A feeling which had only been confirmed when, instead of standing behind his captain like the others, Naruto was directed to stand in front of the captain commander in the middle of the room, all eyes on him. He also didn't miss the way a certain insane captain grinned at him, a small pink-haired head peeking out from over his shoulder and waving at him, smiling. But whatever he had been expecting, the words that came out of Yamamoto's mouth were not it, and he could only stare at the man in both shock and confusion. Uzumaki-san, as of this moment, you're being removed from the 4th division. But then where am I being placed? I like the 4th division, I don't want to be moved. Unfortunately, the choice is no longer yours to make, and as to your first question, you will not be placed in any division. Seeing the confused expression on not just the blonde's face, but those of everyone in the room, Yamamoto banged his staff on the ground to stop the muttering that his words had brought. The fact is, Uzumaki-san, that despite you still not being at captain level, you are also too powerful to be a vice captain anymore. That, along with your potential for the future, has led to infighting within the Gotei 13 over where you should be, and I cannot allow this to continue. Gulping loudly at the man's words, Naruto took a step back when he started walking forward, slowly closing the space between them. You are not the first Shinigami to appear that has been more advanced than others, and it is not the first time it has been cause for issue among the Gotei 13, but you will be the last. Yes, sir? With the permission of Central 46I, Captain Commander Yamamoto Genryusai, Irby create a new branch within the Gotei 13 known simple as Demon Division. This group will be where all advanced Shinigami that cannot be placed in one of the 13 divisions, Shinigami with the raw power and potential to be captains. And with the creation of this group, I named Naruto Uzumaki as the leader. Naruto, along with everyone else in the room, could only stare with their mouths open. The idea of a new group within the Gotei 13, it was unheard of. Blinking, Naruto slowly got down on one knee and bowed, unable to think of what to say. Of course, you will continue your training under Captain Soi Fon, and until you reach captain level you are the leader in nothing but name. But I, along with Central 46, both have confidence that you will be able to achieve it. Seeing that he was in shock, Yamamoto gave a light chuckle, seeming to find the reactions of all the people in the room highly amusing. I understand that this is a lot to take in, and that you will need time to adjust, so I will give it to you. A new barracks will be constructed soon for you, and anyone else that is placed under your care, but until then you will remain at the 4th division. Also, after your training with Captain Soi Fon tomorrow, I need you to report to my office at the 1st division. Unable to do nothing but nod, Naruto slowly got to his feet and left the room, seeming to move on autopilot. A new division, he was being put in charge of a new division, that didn't even have anyone else in it. This was insane. He wasn't ready for something like this, he was happy in the 4th division, and training under Captain Soi Fon. But he couldn't refuse the Captain Commander, or the Central 46, no matter how much he wanted to. And what did he mean the captains had been fighting over him? None of this made any sense at all. Why would they put him in a position like this, just because he had potential? What did Yamamoto mean about this happening before? There were just too many questions, with no answers, and the only person who could give him the answers is the Captain Commander. The Captain Commander's office was traditional, that was the only way Naruto could think to describe it. There was a bonsai tree on his desk, perfectly cared for, with scrolls hanging from the walls and a view of a garden outside the window. The desk itself was low on the ground, and instead of chairs there were pillows to kneel on, and an incense burner on the window sill. When he walked in, Naruto was instantly guided to one of the pillows and handed a cup of tea, the old Shinigami already sipping from his own. For about 5 minutes, neither Naruto nor Yamamoto spoke, the blonde too nervous and the older Shinigami just seeming to enjoy his tea. But just as Naruto was about to speak, Yamamoto let out a sigh and placed his cup down. I understand that everything that is happening is hard for you to understand, Uzumaki-san, and that you must have a lot of questions. I will attempt to answer all I am able to, but hope you understand that there might be some things I cannot answer. Of course, sir, I understand. Nodding, the old man lifted his hand, gesturing for Naruto to start. Why has a whole new division been created? Well, the fact is, Uzumaki-san, you are not the only exceptional Shinigami that we currently have. Though you are the only one known to the entire Gotei 13, the others having been in hiding, most of them in my own division. This new group will be their safe haven, along with your own. I don't understand, why are they in hiding? The only reason I hid myself was out of fear of my Zanpakuto. Lacing his hands under his chin, Yamamoto's eyes lowered slightly, unable to look the blonde in the face. They are in hiding because I ordered them to. Seeing the confusion on the blonde's face, the Captain Commander released a deep sigh. The Gotei 13, Uzumaki-san, is only strong for as long as we remain united. There is a balance that must be kept between the divisions, a balance that must be carefully controlled, or everything will fall to chaos. However, there are people, not unlike yourself, that simple or born better than others. These people are a risk to the balance, because they are too powerful, and there are only ever 13 captains and 13 vice captains at a time. Waiting a moment, the old man continued when he saw Naruto nod in understanding, taking another sip of his tea. Captain Zaraki is also one of these people, and had he not become a captain the moment he challenged the previous captain of the 11th, would have been forced into hiding. You, however, slipped through my net, and found yourself in the 4th division. The moment Captain Unohana came to me about you, I realized that things needed to change, or we risked chaos. It was because of this, the idea of the Demon Division was born, and the reason I had arranged for your intense training. Even your appointment to Vice Captain, while not planned, was a way to train you so you would understand the process of leadership. For a moment after being told this, Naruto could only stare at the old Shinigami, unable to think of anything to say. Though it had answered a lot of his questions, and the idea he wasn't the only person that was considered a special case was nice, it took a bit of the pressure off if nothing else. But that just opened up a new box of questions. Why make me the leader, sir? As you said, I am not yet captain level, and surely there is someone who is. Would it not be better to appoint one of them in my stead? You give yourself too little credit, Uzumaki-san. While there are a few that may be stronger than you are at this time, by the time your training is complete this will not be so. Each of the people being placed into your new division are at least vice captain level, some even higher than that, but have no experience as leaders. You are also already a public face, one that is both acknowledged as for your strength and strength of character. You are a natural lead, as shown by your training of the members of the 4th division, something that makes you a better choice than someone that is more powerful. Naruto didn't miss the way the captain's voice seemed to trail off at the end, as if he was thinking about something important and hard to consider, and when the man realized the blonde had noticed he let out another sigh. Uzumaki-san, there is something you must understand about the people I will be putting in your care. Several of them have been in hiding for a long time, and it is hard for them to keep their power hidden, when they know they could make a difference. I have been trying to convince the Central 46 for years that if this continued, we may have an uprising on our hands, that they would rebel against the Gotei 13 for being forced into the shadows. Your appearance merely helped me tip the scale a little more, thankfully before it was too late, but I know there will still be bad blood between them and us. The other reason I am placing you in charge of this group, is because I trust you. With that last sentence, the full weight of what he was being asked to do came crashing down on Naruto like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just being asked to lead this group, he was being asked to help them out of their forced hiding places and into the light of the Gotei 13. The fact the Captain Commander himself had just told him that he trusted him with this responsibility, that he trusted him capable enough to lead these people, both terrified him and made his proud at the same time. Remembering his lessons with Captain Unohana, Naruto shut off all other thoughts in his head, and focused at the task on hand. It had originally been a way to help him control his bloodlust, but Naruto had found it useful in many situations, both in and out of combat. Letting his features take on a more serious expression, his eyes hardening slightly, Naruto sat a bit straighter in front of the captain. When he saw this, Yamamoto could only smile, knowing that the blonde had finally accepted his new role in the Gotei 13. Nodding, the old Shinigami took 5 folders from under his desk, pushing them across to the blonde. These files hold the names and information on the 5 Shinigami that will be the first to join the Demon Division, handpicked by myself from those that volunteered. This was a condition of the Central 46. For the time being, only these 5 will be allowed under your care, and after you reach the rank of captain others will be allowed to join. You will be required to pick someone from these 5 to be your vice captain, though it can wait until after you have become more familiar with each of them, so take your time and pick wisely. As he was listening to the old man's words, Naruto had reached over and taken the files, looking at the names of the people he would be working with and memorizing their faces. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.